So Gogol, full name Nikolai Vasilievich Gogol-Yanovsky, or Nicky G as scholars like to call him, has been a favorite author of mine for some 20 years. Historically, he was a minor nobleman of mixed Russian, Ukrainian, and Polish heritage, which was complicated back then too. He went back and forth over which identity to emphasize. But to an outsider like me, reading him in translation, what he really feels like is an Eastern European Edgar Allan Poe. And I'm far from the first to make that comparison. They were born in the same year. They both died badly and too young, just 3 years apart. Both were literary geniuses, but also awkward misfits, almost exiles, and both profoundly influenced the developing literature of their times. But for me, the bigger point of similarity is, you could call it style, I would call it outlook. Nabokov put it best in this long, great essay that he wrote on Gogol, where he says that Nicky G believed far more sincerely in the devil than in God. And I think we can agree the same is true of Poe, psychologically, if not religiously. Now, Gogol's novels, they don't do much for me. It's his plays and his short stories that are amazing. And I want to read one of his Ukrainian folklore stories. They remind me a little bit, again, of those early American stories of the farmlands, the local color, that at their worst can be too sentimental and condescending, but at their best are full of color and life and energy and excitement. And this is a ghost story called V. But before we do that, let me read my very favorite story of his, which is one of his St. Petersburg stories. These are, I would call them, extremely urban, and there's this wonderful quality to them. You could call it surreal, but it's more than that. It's almost dreamlike. It captures that feeling of being in a different reality that can be very mysterious and a little lonely, but also a whole lot of fun. So we will start with The Nose. 1. An extraordinarily strange event took place in St. Petersburg on 25 March. Ivan Yakovlevich, a barber who lived on Voznesensky Prospect, his surname has been lost, and all that his shop sign shows is a gentleman with a lathered cheek and the inscription, "We also let blood," woke up rather early one morning and smelled hot bread. Raising himself slightly on his bed, he saw his wife, who was a quite respectable lady and a great coffee drinker, taking some freshly baked rolls out of the oven. "I don't want any coffee today, Praskovya Osipovna," said Ivan Yakovlevich. "I'll make do with a hot roll and onion instead." Here I must explain that Ivan Yakovlevich would really have liked to have had some coffee as well, but knew it was quite out of the question to expect both coffee and rolls, since Praskovya Osipovna did not take very kindly to these whims of his. "Let the old fool have his bread, I don't mind," she thought. "That means extra coffee for me." And she threw a roll onto the table. Ivan pulled his frock coat over his nightshirt for decency's sake, sat down at the table, poured out some salt, peeled 2 onions, took a knife, and with a determined expression on his face, started cutting one of the rolls. When he had sliced the roll in 2, he peered into the middle and was amazed to see something white there. Ivan carefully picked at it with his knife, and he felt it with his finger. "Quite thick," he said to himself. "What on earth could it be?" He poked 2 fingers and pulled out a nose. Ivan Yakovlevich let his arms drop to his sides and began rubbing his eyes and feeling around in the roll again. Yes, it was a nose all right, no mistake about that. And what's more, it seemed a very familiar nose. His face filled with horror, but this horror was nothing compared with his wife's indignation. "You beast, whose nose is that you've cut off?" she cried furiously. "You scoundrel, you drunkard! I'll report it to the police myself, I will. You thief! Come to think of it, I've heard 3 customers say that when they come in for a shave, you start tweaking their noses about so much, it's a wonder they stay on at all." But Ivan felt more dead than alive. He knew that the nose belonged to none other than Collegiate Assessor Kovalyov, whom he shaved on Wednesdays and Sundays. "Wait a minute, Praskovya. I'll wrap it up in a piece of cloth and put it over there in a corner. Let's leave it there for a bit, then I'll try and get rid of it." "I don't want to know. Do you think I'm going to let this sawed-off nose lie about in my room, you fathead? All you can do is strop that blasted razor of yours and let everything else go to pot. Layabout, nightbird. And you expect me to cover up for you with the police? You filthy pig, blockhead. Get that nose out of here. Out! Do what you like with it, but I don't want that thing hanging around here a minute longer." Ivan Yakovlevich was absolutely stunned. He thought and thought, but just didn't know what to make of it. "I'm damned if I know what's happened," he said at last, scratching the back of his ear. "I can't say for certain if I came home drunk or not last night. All I know is it's crazy. After all, bread is something you bake, but a nose is quite different. Can't make head or tail of it." Ivan Yakovlevich lapsed into silence. The thought that the police might search the place, find the nose, and afterwards bring a charge against him very nearly sent him out of his mind. Already he could see that scarlet collar, beautifully embroidered with silver, that sword, and he began shaking all over. Finally, he put on his undergarments and boots, pulled on all that nonsense, and with Praskovya Osipovna's vigorous invective ringing in his ears, wrapped the nose up in a piece of cloth and went out into the street. All he wanted was to stuff it away somewhere, either hiding it between two curbstones by someone's front door, or else accidentally dropping it and slinking off down a side street. But, as luck would have it, he kept bumping into friends who would insist on asking, "Where are you off to?" or "It's a bit early for shaving customers, isn't it?" with the result that he didn't have a chance to get rid of it. Once he did manage to drop it, but a policeman pointed with his halberd and said, "Pick that up! Can't you see you've dropped something?" And Ivan Yakovlevich had to pick it up and hide it in his pocket. Despair gripped him, especially as the streets were getting more and more crowded now as the shops and stalls began to open. He decided to make his way to St. Isaac's Bridge and see if he could throw the nose into the river Neva without anyone seeing him. But here I am rather at fault for not having told you before something about Ivan Yakovlevich, who in many ways was a man worthy of respect. Ivan Yakovlevich, like any honest Russian working man, was a terrible drunkard, and although he spent all day shaving other people's beards, his own was perpetually unshaven. His frock coat, Ivan Yakovlevich never wore a dress coat, could best be described as piebald. That is to say, it was black, but with brownish yellow and gray spots all over it. His collar was very shiny, and 3 loosely hanging threads showed that some buttons had once been there. Ivan Yakovlevich was a great cynic, and whenever Kovalyov, the collegiate assessor, said, "Your hands always stink," while he was being shaved, Ivan Yakovlevich would say, "But why should they stink?" The collegiate assessor used to reply, "Don't ask me, my dear chap, all I know is they stink." Ivan Yakovlevich would answer by taking a pinch of snuff and then, by way of retaliation, lather all over Kovalyov's cheeks, under his nose, behind the ears, and beneath his beard, in short, wherever he felt like covering him with soap. By now this respectable citizen of ours had already reached St. Isaac's Bridge. First of all, he had a good look round. Then he leaned over the rails, trying to pretend he was looking under the bridge to see if there were many fish there, and furtively threw the packet into the water. He felt as if a couple of hundredweight had been lifted all at once from his shoulders, and he even managed to produce a smile. Instead of going off to shave civil servants' chins, he headed for a shop bearing the sign "Hot Meals and Tea" for a glass of punch. Suddenly he saw a policeman at one end of the bridge, looking very impressive, with broad whiskers, a 3-cornered hat, and a sword. He went cold all over as the policeman beckoned to him and said, "Come here, my friend." Recognizing the uniform, Ivan Yakovlevich took his cap off before he had taken half a dozen steps, tripped up to him and greeted him with, "Good morning, Your Honor." "No, no, my dear chap, none of your honor. Just tell me what you were up to on the bridge." "Honest, officer, I was on my way to shave a customer and stopped to see how fast the current was." "You're lying. You can't really expect me to believe that. You'd better come clean at once." "I'll give Your Honor a free shave twice, even 3 times a week. Honest, I will," answered Ivan Yakovlevich. "No, no, my friend, that won't do. 3 barbers look after me already, and it's an honor for them to shave me. Will you please tell me what you were up to?" Ivan Yakovlevich turned pale. But at this point, everything became so completely enveloped in mist, it really is impossible to say what happened afterwards. 2. Collegiate Assessor Kovalyov woke up rather early and made a burring noise with his lips. He always did this when he woke up, though if you asked him why, he could not give you any good reason. Kovalyov stretched himself and asked for the small mirror that stood on the table to be brought over to him. He wanted to have a look at a pimple that had made its appearance on his nose the previous evening, but to his extreme astonishment found that instead of a nose, there was nothing but an absolutely flat surface. In a terrible panic, Kovalyov asked for some water and rubbed his eyes with a towel. No mistake about it. His nose was gone. He began pinching himself to make sure he was not sleeping, but to all intents and purposes he was wide awake. Collegiate Assessor Kovalyov sprang out of bed and shook himself. Still no nose. He asked for his clothes, and off he dashed straight to the head of police. In the meantime, however, a few words should be said about Kovalyov, so that the reader may see what kind of collegiate assessor this man was. You really cannot compare these collegiate assessors who acquire office through academic qualifications with the variety appointed in the Caucasus. The two species are quite distinct. Collegiate assessors with diplomas from learned bodies. But Russia is such an amazing country that if you pass any remark about one collegiate assessor, every assessor from Riga to Kamchatka will take it personally. And the same goes for all people holding titles and government ranks. Kovalyov belonged to the Caucasian variety. He had been a collegiate assessor for only 2 years, and therefore could not forget it for a single minute. To make himself sound more important and to give more weight and nobility to his status, he never called himself collegiate assessor, but major. If he met a woman in the street selling shirt fronts, he would say, "Listen, dear, come and see me at home. My flat's in Sadovaya Street. All you have to do is ask if Major Kovalyov lives there, and anyone will show you the way." If he happened to meet a pretty girl, he would whisper some secret instructions and then say, "Just ask for Major Kovalyov, my dear." Therefore, throughout this story, we will call this collegiate assessor Major. Major Kovalyov was in the habit of taking a daily stroll along Nevsky Prospect. His shirt collar was always immaculately clean and well starched. His whiskers were the kind you usually find among provincial surveyors, architects, and regimental surgeons, as well as those who have some sort of connection with the police, with anyone, in fact, who has full, rosy cheeks and plays a good hand at whist. These were the kind of whiskers that usually reach from the middle of the face right across to the nostrils. Major Kovalyov always carried plenty of seals with him, seals bearing coats of arms or engraved with the words Wednesday, Thursday, Monday, and so on. Major Kovalyov had come to St. Petersburg with the express purpose of finding a position in keeping with his rank. If he were successful, he would get a vice-governorship, but failing that, a job as an administrative clerk in some important government department would have to do. Major Kovalyov was not averse to marriage as long as his bride happened to be worth 200,000 rubles. And now the reader can judge for himself this major's state of mind when, instead of a fairly presentable and reasonably sized nose, all he saw was an absolutely preposterous, flat, smooth space. As if this were not bad enough, there was not a cab in sight, and he had to walk home, keeping himself huddled up in his cloak and with a handkerchief over his face to make people think he was bleeding. But perhaps I dreamt it. How could I be so stupid as to go and lose my nose? With these thoughts, he dropped into a coffee house to take a look at himself in a mirror. Fortunately, the shop was empty, except for some waiters sweeping up and tidying the chairs. A few of them, rather bleary-eyed, were carrying trays laden with hot pies. Yesterday's newspapers, covered in coffee stains, lay scattered on the tables and chairs. "Well, thank God there's no one about," he said. "Now I can have a look." He approached the mirror rather gingerly and peered into it. "Damn it! What kind of trick is this?" he cried, spitting on the floor. "If only there were something to take its place, but there's nothing." He bit his lips in annoyance, left the coffee house, and decided not to smile or look at anyone, which was not like him at all. Suddenly he stood rooted to the spot near the front door of some house and witnessed a most incredible spectacle. A carriage drew up at the entrance porch. The doors flew open, and out jumped a uniformed, stooping gentleman who dashed up the steps. The feeling of horror and amazement that gripped Kovalyov when he recognized his own nose defies description. After this extraordinary sight, everything went topsy-turvy. He could hardly keep to his feet, but decided at all costs to wait until the nose returned to the carriage, although he was shaking all over and felt quite feverish. About 2 minutes later, a nose really did come out. It was wearing a gold-braided uniform with a high stand-up collar and chamois trousers, and had a sword at its side. From the plumes on its hat, one could tell that it held the exalted rank of state councillor, and it was abundantly clear that the nose was going to visit someone. It looked right, then left, shouted to the coachman, "Let's go," climbed in, and drove off. Poor Kovalyov nearly went out of his mind. He did not know what to make of it. How, in fact, could a nose, which only yesterday was in the middle of his face and which could not possibly walk about or drive in a carriage, suddenly turn up in a uniform? He ran after the carriage, which fortunately did not travel very far, and came to a halt outside Kazan Cathedral. Kovalyov rushed into the cathedral square, elbowed his way through a crowd of beggar women who always used to make him laugh because of the way they covered their faces, leaving only slits for the eyes, and made his way in. Only a few people were at prayer, all of them standing by the entrance. Kovalyov felt so distraught that he was in no condition for praying, and his eyes searched every nook and cranny for the nose in uniform. At length he spotted it standing by one of the walls to the side. The nose's face was completely hidden by the high collar, and it was praying with an expression of profound piety. What's the best way of approaching it? Thought Kovalyov. Judging by its uniform, its hat, its whole appearance, it must be a state councillor. But I'm damned if I know how to go about it. He tried to attract its attention by coughing, but the nose did not interrupt its devotions for 1 second and continued to perform low bows. "My dear sir," Kovalyov said, summoning up his courage. "My dear sir." "What do you want?" replied the nose, turning around. "I don't know how best to put it, sir, but it strikes me as very peculiar. Don't you know where you belong? And where do I find you? In church, of all places. I'm sure you'll agree that—" "Please forgive me, but would you mind telling me what you're talking about? Explain yourself." "How can I make myself clear?" Kovalyov wondered. Nerving himself once more, he said, "Of course, I am, as it happens, a major. You will agree that it's not done for someone in my position to walk around minus a nose. It's all right for some old woman selling peeled oranges on the Voskresensky Bridge to sit there without one, but as I'm hoping to be promoted soon. Besides this, I'm acquainted with several highly placed ladies. Madame Shekhtyaria, for example, a state councillor's wife, and others. You can judge for yourself. I really don't know what to say, my dear sir." He shrugged his shoulders as he said this. "If one considers this from the point of view of duty and honor, then you yourself will understand." "I don't understand a thing," the nose replied. "Please make yourself clear." "My dear sir," continued Kovalyov in a smug voice, "I really don't know what you mean by that. It's plain enough for anyone to see. Unless you want— Don't you realize that you are my own nose?" The nose looked at the major and frowned a little. "My dear fellow, you are mistaken. I am a person in my own right. Furthermore, I don't see that we can have anything in common. Judging from your uniform buttons, I should say you are from another government department." With these words, the nose turned away and continued its prayers. Kovalyov was so confused he didn't know what to do or think. At that moment, he heard the pleasant rustle of a woman's dress, and an elderly lady, bedecked with lace, came by, accompanied by a slim girl wearing a white dress, which showed her shapely figure to a very good advantage, and a pale yellow hat as light as pastry. A tall footman with enormous whiskers and what seemed to be a dozen collars stationed himself behind them and opened his snuff-box. Kovalyov went closer, pulled the linen collar out of his shirt front up high, straightened the seals hanging on his gold watch chain, and, smiling over all his face, turned his attention to the slim girl, who bent over to pray like a spring flower and kept lifting her little white hand with its almost transparent fingers to her forehead. The smile on Kovalyov's face grew even more expansive when he saw beneath her hat a little rounded chin of dazzling white and cheeks flushed with the color of the first rose of spring. But suddenly he jumped backwards as though he had been burned. He remembered that instead of a nose he had absolutely nothing, and tears streamed from his eyes. He swung round to tell the nose in uniform straight out that it was only masquerading as a state councillor, that it was an impostor and a scoundrel, and really nothing else than his own private property, his nose. But the nose had already gone. It had managed to slip off unseen, probably to pay someone a visit. This reduced Kovalyov to a state of utter despair. He went out and stood for a minute or so under the colonnade, carefully looking around him in the hope of spotting the nose. He remembered quite distinctly that it was wearing a plumed hat and a gold-embroidered uniform, but he had not noticed what its greatcoat was like, or the color of its carriage, or its horses, or even if there was a liveried footman at the back. What's more, there were so many carriages careening to and fro, and so fast, that it was practically impossible to recognize any of them, and even if he could, there was no way of making them stop. It was a beautiful sunny day. Nevsky Prospect was packed. From the police headquarters right down to the Anichkov Bridge, a whole floral cascade of ladies flowed along the pavements. Not far off he could see that court councillor whom he referred to as lieutenant colonel, especially if there happened to be other people around. And there was Yarygin, a head clerk in the Senate, and a very close friend of his who always lost at whist when he played in a party of 8. Another major, a collegiate assessor of the Caucasian variety, waved to him to come over and have a chat. "Blast and damn," said Kovalyov, hailing a droshky. "Driver, take me straight to the chief of police." He climbed into the droshky and shouted, "Drive like the devil!" "Is the police commissioner in?" he said as soon as he entered the hall. "No, sir, he's not," said the porter. "He left only a few minutes ago." "This really is my day." "Yes," said the porter. "You've only just missed him. A minute ago you'd have caught him." Kovalyov, his handkerchief still pressed to his face, climbed into the droshky again and cried out in a despairing voice, "Let's go!" "Where?" asked the driver. "Straight on." "Straight on? But it's a dead end here. You can only go right or left." This last question made Kovalyov stop and think. In his position, the best thing to do is to go first to the city security office, not because it was directly connected with the police, but because things got done there much quicker than in any other government department. There was no sense in going for satisfaction direct to the head of the department where the nose claimed to work, since anyone could see from the answers he had got before that the nose considered nothing holy and was just as capable now of lying as it had done before, claiming never to have set eyes on him. So just as Kovalyov was about to tell the driver to go straight to the security office, it again struck him that the scoundrel and impostor who had behaved so shamelessly at their first encounter could quite easily take advantage of the delay and slip out of the city, in which event all his efforts to find it would be futile and might even drag on for another month, God forbid. Finally, inspiration came from above. He decided to go straight to the newspaper offices and publish an advertisement, giving such a detailed description of the nose that anyone who happened to meet it would at once turn it over to Kovalyov, or at least tell him where he could find it. Deciding that this was the best course of action, he ordered the driver to go straight to the newspaper offices, and throughout the whole journey never once stopped pummeling the driver in the back with his fist and shouting, "Faster, damn you, faster!" "But, sir," the driver retorted as he shook his head and flicked his reins at the horse, which had a coat as long as a spaniel's. Finally, the droshky came to a halt, and the breathless Kovalyov tore into a small waiting room where a gray-haired, bespectacled clerk in an old frock coat was sitting at a table with his pen between his teeth, counting out copper coins. "Who sees to advertisements here?" Kovalyov shouted. "Ah, good morning." "Good morning," replied the gray-haired clerk, raising his eyes for 1 second, then looking down again at the little piles of money spread out on the table. "I want to publish an advertisement." "Just one moment, if you don't mind," the clerk answered as he wrote down a figure with one hand and moved 2 beads on his abacus with the other. A footman who, judging by his gold-braided livery and generally very smart appearance, obviously worked in some noble house, was standing by the table holding a piece of paper, and considering it the right thing to display a certain degree of bonhomie, started rattling away. "Believe me, sir, that nasty little dog just isn't worth 80 kopecks. I mean, I wouldn't even give 8 for it. But the Countess adores it, just dotes on it, she does. She'll give anyone who finds it a reward of 100 rubles. If we're going to be honest with one another, I'll tell you quite openly there is no accounting for taste. I could understand a fancier paying anything up to 500, even 1,000 for a deerhound or a poodle, as long as it's a good dog." The worthy clerk listened to him solemnly while he carried on totting up the words in the advertisement. The room was crowded with old women, salesmen, and house porters, all holding advertisements. In one of these, a coachman of sober disposition was seeking employment. In another, a carriage, hardly used and brought from Paris in 1914, was up for sale. In another, a 19-year-old servant girl with laundry experience and prepared to do other work was looking for a job. Other advertisements offered a droshky for sale, in good condition apart from one missing spring, a young and spirited dapple-gray colt, 17 years old, radish and turnip seeds only just arrived from London, a country house with every modern convenience, including stabling for 2 horses and enough land for planting an excellent birch or fir forest. And one invited prospective buyers of old boot soles to attend certain auction rooms between the hours of 8 and 3 daily. The room into which all these people were crammed was small and extremely stuffy, but Collegiate Assessor Kovalyov couldn't smell anything as he had covered his face with a handkerchief, and he couldn't have smelled anything anyway as his nose had disappeared God knows where. "My dear sir, if I may respect your—" "It's really most urgent," he said, beginning to lose patience. "Just a minute, if you don't mind. 2 rubles 43 kopecks, nearly ready. 1 ruble 64 kopecks, the gray-haired clerk muttered as he shoved pieces of paper at the old ladies and servants standing around. Finally, he turned to Kovalyov and said, "What do you want?" "I want," Kovalyov began, "something very fishy's been going on, whether it's some nasty practical joke or a plain case of fraud. I can't say as yet. All I want you to do is offer a substantial reward for the first person to find the blackguard." "May I inquire as to your name, sir?" "Why do you need that? I can't tell you. Too many people know me. Mrs. Chektariev, for example, who's married to a state councillor. Mrs. Pelageya Podtochin, a staff officer's wife. They'd find out who it was at once. God forbid. Just put collegiate assessor, or even better, gentleman holding the rank of major." "And the missing person was a household serf of yours?" Household serf? The crime wouldn't be half as serious. It's my nose that's disappeared, God knows where. Strange name. And did this Mr. Nose steal much? My nose, I'm trying to say. You don't understand. It's my own nose that's disappeared. It's a diabolical practical joke someone's played on me. How did it disappear? I don't follow. I can't tell you how. But please understand, my nose is driving at this very minute all over town, calling itself a state councilor. That's why I'm asking you to print this advertisement announcing the first person who catches it should return the nose to its rightful owner as soon as possible. Imagine what it's like being without such a conspicuous part of your anatomy. If it were just a small toe, I could put my boot on and no one would be any the wiser. On Thursdays, I go to Mrs. Chektaryev's, she's married to a state councilor, and Mrs. Podtochin, who has a staff officer for a husband and a very pretty little daughter as well. Also, they're all very close friends of mine, so just imagine what it would be like. In my state, I can't possibly visit any of them. The clerk's tightly pressed lips showed he was deep in thought. I can't print an advertisement like that in our paper, he said after a long silence. What? Why not? I'll tell you, a paper can get a bad name. If everyone started announcing his nose had run away, I don't know how it would all end. And enough false reports and rumors get past editorial already. But why does it strike you as so absurd? I certainly don't think so. That's what you think. But only last week there was a similar case. A clerk came here with an advertisement, just like you. It cost him 2 rubles, 73 kopecks, and all he wanted to advertise was a runaway black poodle. And what do you think he was up to, really? In the end, we had a libel case on our hands. The poodle was meant as a satire on a government cashier. I can't remember what ministry he came from. But I want to publish an advertisement about my nose, not a poodle, and that's as near myself as damn it. No, I can't accept that kind of advertisement. But I've lost my nose. Then you'd better see a doctor about it. I've heard there's a certain kind of specialist who can fix you up with any kind of nose you like. Anyway, you seem the cheery sort, and I can see you like to have your little joke. By all that's holy, I swear I'm telling you the truth. If you really want me to, I'll show you what I mean. I shouldn't bother if I were you, the clerk continued, taking a pinch of snuff. However, if it's really no trouble, he added, leaning forward out of curiosity, then I shouldn't mind having a quick look. The collegiate assessor removed the handkerchief. Well, how very peculiar. It's quite flat, just like a freshly cooked pancake. Incredibly flat. So much for your objections. Now you've seen it with your own eyes, and you can't possibly refuse. I'll be particularly grateful for this little favor, and I'm delighted that this little incident has afforded me the pleasure of making your acquaintance. The major, evidently, had decided that a little toadying might do the trick. Of course, it's no problem printing the advertisement, the clerk said, but I can't see what you stand to gain by it. If you like, why not give it to someone with a flair for journalism? Then he can write it up as a very rare freak of nature and have it published as an article in the Northern Bee. Here he took another pinch of snuff, so that the young people might benefit from it. Here he wiped his nose. Or else as something of interest to the general public. The collegiate assessor's hopes were completely dashed. He looked down at the bottom of the page of the theater guide. The name of a rather pretty actress almost brought a smile to his face, and he reached down to his pocket to see if he had a 5-ruble note, since in his opinion staff officers should only sit in the stalls. But then he remembered his nose, and he knew he could not possibly think of going to the theater. Apparently even the clerk was touched by Kovalyov's terrible predicament and thought it would not hurt to cheer him up with a few words of sympathy. I deeply regret that such a strange thing has happened to you. Would you care for a pinch of snuff? It's very good for headaches, and it puts fresh heart into you. It's even good for hemorrhoids. With these words he offered Kovalyov his snuff-box, deftly flipping back the lid, which bore a portrait of some lady in a hat. This unintentionally thoughtless action made Kovalyov lose patience altogether. I don't understand how you can joke at a time like this, he said angrily. Are you so blind you can't see that I've nothing to smell with? To hell with your snuff. I can't bear to look at it. And anyway, you might as well at least offer me some real French râpé, not that filthy Berezhinsky brand. After this declaration, he strode furiously out of the newspaper office and went off to the local inspector of police, a fanatical lover of sugar, whose hall and dining room were crammed full of sugar cubes presented by merchants who wanted to keep well in with him. At that moment, the cook was removing the inspector's regulation jackboots. His sword and all his military trappings were hanging peacefully in the corner, and his 3-year-old son was already fingering his awesome tricorn. and he himself, after a warrior's life of martial exploits, was now preparing to savor the pleasures of peace. Kovalyov arrived just when he was having a nice good stretch, grunting and saying, "Now for a 2 hours nap." Our collegiate assessor had clearly chosen a very bad time for his visit. The inspector was a great patron of the arts and industry, but most of all he loved government banknotes. "There's nothing finer than banknotes," he used to say. "They don't need feeding, they take up very little room, and they slip nicely into the pocket, and they don't break if you drop them." The inspector gave Kovalyov a rather cold welcome and said that after dinner wasn't at all the time to start investigations, that nature herself had decreed a rest after meals. From this, our collegiate assessor concluded that the inspector was well versed in the wisdom of the classics, that respectable men do not get their noses ripped off, and that there were no end of majors knocking around who were not too fussy about their underwear and who were in the habit of visiting the most disreputable places. These few home truths stung Kovalyov to the quick. Here I must point out that Kovalyov was an extremely sensitive man. He did not mind people making personal remarks about him, but it was a different matter when aspersions were cast upon his rank and social standing. As far as he was concerned, they could say what they liked about subalterns on the stage, but staff officers should be exempt from attack. The reception given him by the inspector startled him so much that he shook his head, threw out his arms, and said in a dignified voice, "To be frank, after these remarks of yours, which I find very offensive, I have nothing more to say." And he walked out. He arrived home hardly able to feel his feet beneath him. It was already getting dark. After his fruitless inquiries, his flat seemed extremely dismal and depressing. As he entered the hall, he saw his footman Ivan lying on a soiled leather couch, spitting at the ceiling, managing to hit the same spot with a fair degree of success. The nonchalance of the man infuriated him, and Kovalyov hit him across the forehead with his hat and said, "You fat pig, haven't you anything better to do?" Ivan promptly jumped up and rushed to take off Kovalyov's coat. Tired and depressed, the major went to his room, threw himself into an armchair, and after a few sighs said, my God, what have I done to deserve this? If I'd lost an arm or a leg, it wouldn't be so bad. Even without any ears, things wouldn't be very pleasant, but it wouldn't be the end of the world. A man without a nose, though, is God knows what, neither fish nor fowl, just something to be thrown out the window. If my nose had been lopped off during the war or in a duel, at least I might have some say in the matter. But to lose it for no reason at all, and with nothing to show for it, not even a kopeck. No, it's absolutely impossible. It can't have gone just like that. Never. Must have been a dream, or perhaps I drank some of that vodka I used for rubbing down my beard after shaving instead of water. That idiot Ivan couldn't have put it away, and I must have picked it up by mistake. To convince himself that he was not in fact drunk, the major pinched himself so hard that he cried out in pain, which really did convince him he was awake and in full possession of his senses. He stealthily crept over to the mirror and screwed up his eyes in the hope that his nose would reappear in its proper place, but at once he jumped back, exclaiming, "That ridiculous blank space again!" It was absolutely incomprehensible. If a button or a silver spoon or his watch or something of that sort had been missing, that would have been understandable. But for his nose to disappear from his own flat, Major Kovalyov weighed up all the evidence and decided that the most likely explanation of all was that Mrs. Podtochin, the staff officer's wife, who wanted to marry off her daughter to him, was to blame and no one else. In fact, he liked chasing after her, but never came to proposing. And when the staff officer's wife told him straight out that she was offering him her daughter's hand, he politely withdrew, excusing himself on the ground that he was still a young man and that he wanted to devote another 5 years to the service, by which time he would be just 42. So to get her revenge, the staff officer's wife must have decided to ruin him, and for that purpose had hired some old witches. It was quite inconceivable that his nose had been cut off. No one had visited him in his flat. His barber Ivan Yakovlevich had shaved him only last Wednesday, and the rest of that day and the whole of Thursday his nose had been intact. All this he remembered quite clearly. Moreover, he would have been in pain, and the wound could not have healed as flat as a pancake in such a short time. He began planning what to do. Either he would sue the staff officer's wife for damages, or he would go and see her personally and accuse her point blank. But he was distracted from these thoughts by the sight of some chinks of light in the door, which meant Ivan had lit a candle in the hall. Soon afterwards, Ivan appeared in person, holding the candle in front of him so that it brightened up the whole room. Kovalyov's first reaction was to seize his handkerchief and cover up the bare place where only yesterday his nose had been, to stop that stupid man from gaping at his master's weird appearance. No sooner had Ivan gone back to his cubbyhole than a strange voice was heard in the hall. Does Collegiate Assessor Kovalyov live here? Please, come in. The Major's home, said Kovalyov, springing to his feet and opening the door. A smart-looking police officer with plump cheeks and whiskers that were neither too light nor too dark, the same police officer who had stood on St. Isaac's Bridge at the beginning of our story, made his entrance. Are you the gentleman who has lost his nose? Yes, that's me. It's been found. What did you say? Cried Major Kovalyov. He could hardly speak for joy. He looked wide-eyed at the police officer, the candlelight flickering on his fat cheeks and thick lips. How did you find it? Very strange. We intercepted it just as it was boarding the stagecoach bound for Riga. Its passport was made out in the name of some civil servant. Strangely enough, I mistook it for a gentleman at first. Fortunately, I had my spectacles with me, so I could see it was really a nose. I'm very short-sighted, and if you happen to stand just in front of me, I can only make out your face, but not your nose or your beard or anything else, in fact. My mother-in-law, that is to say on my wife's side, suffers from the same complaint. Kovalyov was beside himself. Where is it? I'll go right away to claim it. Don't excite yourself, sir. I knew how much you wanted it back, so I've brought it with me. Very strange, but the main culprit in this little affair seems to be that swindler of a barber from Voznesensky Street. He's down at the station now. I've had my eyes on him for a long time now on suspicion of drunkenness and larceny, and only the day before yesterday he was found stealing a dozen buttons from a shop. You'll find your nose just as it was when you lost it. And the police officer dipped into his pocket and pulled out the nose wrapped up in a piece of paper. That's it, cried Kovalyov. No mistake. You must stay and have a cup of tea with me. That would give me great pleasure, but I just couldn't. From here I have to go direct to the House of Correction. The price of food has rocketed. My mother-in-law on my wife's side is living with me, and all the children as well. The eldest boy seems very promising, very bright, but we haven't the money to send him to school. Kovalyov guessed what he was after and took a note from the table and pressed it into the officer's hands. The police officer bowed very low and went out into the street, and almost simultaneously Kovalyov could hear him telling some stupid peasant who had driven his cart up on the pavement what he thought of him. When the police officer had gone, our collegiate assessor felt rather bemused, and only after a few minutes did he come to his senses at all. So intense and unexpected was the joy he felt. He carefully took the nose in his cupped hands and once more subjected it to close scrutiny. Yes, that's it, Major Kovalyov said. And there, the pimple that came up yesterday on the left-hand side. The major almost laughed with joy. But nothing is lasting in this world. Even joy begins to fade after only 1 minute. 2 minutes later, and it's weaker still, until finally it's swallowed up in our everyday prosaic state of mind, just as a ripple made by a pebble gradually merges with the smooth surface of the water. After some thought, Kovalyov concluded that all was not right. Yes, the nose had been found, but there still remained the problem of putting it back in place. What if it doesn't stick? And this question, which he now asked himself, made the major turn pale. With a feeling of inexpressible horror, he rushed to the table and pulled the mirror nearer, as he was afraid that he might stick the nose on crooked. His hands trembled. With great care and caution, he pushed it into place. But oh! The nose just would not stick. He warmed it a little by pressing it to his mouth and breathing on it, and then pressed it again to the smooth space between his cheeks. But try as he might, the nose would not stay on. "Come on now, stay on, you fool," he said. But the nose seemed to be made of wood and fell to the table with a strange cork-like sound. The major's face quivered convulsively. "Perhaps I can graft it," he said apprehensively. But no matter how many times he tried to put it back, all his efforts were futile. He called Ivan and told him to fetch the doctor, who happened to live in the same block, in the best flat on the first floor. This doctor was a handsome man with fine whiskers as black as pitch and a fresh-looking, healthy wife. Every morning he used to eat apples and was terribly meticulous about keeping his mouth clean, spending at least 3/4 of an hour rinsing it out every day and using 5 different varieties of toothbrush to polish his teeth. He came right away. When he had asked the major if he had had this trouble for very long, the doctor lifted Major Kovalyov's head by the chin and prodded him with his thumb in the spot once occupied by the nose, so sharply that the major hit the wall very hard with the back of his head. The doctor told him not to worry and made him stand a little way from the wall and lean his head first to the right. Pinching the place where the nose had been, the doctor said, Then he ordered him to move his head to the left and produced another, Finally he prodded him again, making Kovalyov's head twitch like a horse having its teeth inspected. After this examination, the doctor shook his head and said, "It's no good. It's best to stay as you are, otherwise you'll only make it worse. Of course, it's possible to have it stuck on, and I could do this for you quite easily, but I assure you it would look terrible." "That's marvelous, that is. How can I carry on without a nose?" said Kovalyov. "Things can't get any worse. The devil knows what's going on. How can I go about looking like a freak? I mix with nice people. I'm expected at 2 soirees today. I know all the best people. Mrs. Chekhtyarev, a state councillor's wife. Mrs. Podtochin, a staff officer's wife. Now, after the way she's behaved, I won't have anything more to do with her, except when I get the police on her trail." Kovalyov went on pleading. "Please do me this one favor. Isn't there any way? Even if you only get it to hold on, it wouldn't be so bad. And if there were any risk of it falling off, I could keep it there with my hand. I don't dance, which is a help because any violent movement might make it drop off. And you may rest assured I wouldn't be slow in showing my appreciation, as far as my pocket will allow, of course." The doctor then said in a voice which could not be called loud or even soft, but persuasive and arresting, "I never practice my art from purely mercenary motives. This is contrary to my rule of conduct and all professional ethics. True, I make a charge for private visits, but only so as not to offend patients by refusing to take their money. Of course, I could put your nose back if I wanted to, but I give you my word of honor, if you know what's good for you, it would be far worse if I tried. Let nature take its course. Wash the area as much as you can with cold water, and believe me, you'll feel just as good as when you had a nose. Now, as far as the nose is concerned, put it in a jar of alcohol. Better still, soak it in 2 tablespoonsful of sour vodka and warmed up vinegar, and you'll get good money for it. I'll take it myself if you don't want it." "No, I wouldn't sell it for anything," Kovalyov cried desperately. "I'd rather lose it again." "Then I'm sorry," replied the doctor, bowing himself out. "I wanted to help you. At least I've tried hard enough." With these words, the doctor made a very dignified exit. Kovalyov did not even look at his face and felt so dazed that all he could make out were the doctor's snowy white cuffs sticking out from the sleeves of his black dress coat. The very next day he decided, before going to the police, to write to the staff officer's wife and ask her to put back in its proper place what belonged to him without further ado. The letter read as follows: "Dear Mrs. Alexandra Grigoryevna, I cannot understand this strange behavior on your part. You can be sure, though, that it won't get you anywhere, and it certainly won't force me to marry your daughter. Moreover, you can rest assured that regarding my nose, I am familiar with the whole history of this affair from the very beginning, and I also know that you and no one else are the prime instigator. Its sudden detachment from its rightful place, its subsequent flight, its masquerading as a civil servant, and then its reappearance in its natural state are nothing else than the result of black magic carried out by yourself or by those practicing the same very honorable art. I consider it my duty to warn you that if the above-mentioned nose is not back in its proper place by today, then I shall be compelled to ask for the law's protection. I remain, dear madam, your very faithful servant, Platon Kovalyov." "Dear Mr. Kovalyov, I was simply staggered by your letter. To be honest, I never expected anything of this kind from you, particularly those remarks which are quite uncalled for. I would have you know that I never received that civil servant mentioned by you in my house, whether disguised or not. True, Philip Ivanovich Potanchikov used to call, although he wanted to ask for my daughter's hand, and despite the fact that he was a very sober, respectable, and learned gentleman, I never gave him any cause for hope. And then you go on to mention your nose. If by this you mean to say I wanted to make you look foolish, that is, to put you off with a formal refusal, then all I can say is that I'm very surprised that you can talk like this, as you know well enough my feelings on the matter are quite different. And if you care to make an official proposal to my daughter, I will gladly give my consent, for this has always been my dearest wish, and in this hope I am always at your disposal. Yours sincerely, Alexandra Podtochin." "No," said Kovalyov when he had read the letter. "She's not to blame. Impossible. A guilty person could never write a letter like that." The collegiate assessor knew what he was talking about in this case, as he had been sent to the Caucasus several times to carry out legal inquiries. "How on earth did this happen, then? It's impossible to make head or tail of it," he said, letting his arms drop to his sides. Meanwhile, rumors about the strange occurrence had spread throughout the capital, not, need we say, without a few embellishments. At the time, everyone seemed very preoccupied with the supernatural. Only a short time before, some experiments in magnetism had been all the rage. Besides, the stories of the dancing chairs in Konyasheny Street was still fresh in people's minds, so no one was particularly surprised to hear about Collegiate Assessor Kovalyov's nose taking a regular stroll along Nevsky Prospect at exactly 3 o'clock every afternoon. Every day, crowds of inquisitive people flocked there. Someone said they'd seen the nose in Junker's store, and this produced such a crush outside that the police had to be called. One fairly respectable-looking, bewhiskered entrepreneur who sold stale cakes outside the theater knocked together some handsome, solid-looking wooden benches and hired them out at 80 kopecks a time for the curious to stand on. One retired colonel left home especially early one morning, and after a great struggle managed to barge his way through to the front. But to his great annoyance, instead of a nose in the shop window, all he could see was an ordinary woolen jersey and a lithograph showing a girl adjusting her stocking while a dandy with a small beard and cutaway waistcoat peered out at her from behind a tree, a picture that had hung there in that identical spot for more than 10 years. He left feeling very cross and was heard to say, "Misleading the public with such ridiculous and far-fetched stories shouldn't be allowed." Afterwards, it was rumored that Major Kovalyov's nose was no longer to be seen strolling along Nevsky Prospect, but was in the habit of walking in Tavrichesky Park, and that it had been doing so for some time. When Khosrev Mirza lived there, he was astonished at this freak of nature. Some of the students from the College of Surgeons went to have a look. One well-known, very respectable lady wrote specially to the head park keeper, asking him to show her children this very rare phenomenon, and if possible, give them an instructive and edifying commentary at the same time. These events came as a blessing to those socialites, indispensable for any successful party, who loved amusing the ladies and whose stock of stories was completely exhausted at the time. A few respectful and high-minded citizens were very upset. One indignant gentleman said that he was at a loss to understand how such absurd cock-and-bull stories could gain currency in the present enlightened century, and that the complete indifference shown by the authorities was past comprehension. Clearly, this gentleman was the type who likes to make the government responsible for everything, even their daily quarrels with their wives. And afterwards, but here again the whole incident becomes enveloped in mist, and what happened later remains a complete mystery. 3. The world is full of the most outrageous nonsense. Sometimes things happen which you would hardly think possible. That very same nose, which had paraded itself as a state councillor and created such an uproar in the city, suddenly turned up, as if nothing had happened, in its rightful place, that is to say, between Major Kovalyov's 2 cheeks. This was on the 7th of April. He woke up and happened to glance in the mirror. There was his nose. He grabbed it with his hand to make sure, but there was no doubt this time. "Aha!" cried Kovalyov, and if Ivan hadn't come in at that very moment, he would have joyfully danced a trepak round the room in his bare feet. He ordered some soap and water to be brought right away, and as he washed himself, looked into the mirror again. The nose was there. He had another look as he dried himself. Yes, the nose was still there. "Look, Ivan, I've got a pimple on my nose." Kovalyov thought, God, supposing he replies, "No, there's no pimple, but no nose either." But Ivan answered, "Your nose is quite all right, sir. I can't see any pimple." "Thank God for that," the major said to himself, and clicked his fingers. At this moment, Ivan Yakovlevich, the barber, poked his head round the corner, but timidly this time, like a cat which has just been beaten for stealing fat. "Before you start, are your hands clean?" Kovalyov shouted from the other side of the room. "Perfectly clean." "You're lying." "On my life, sir, they're clean." "Well, they better be." Kovalyov sat down. Ivan Yakovlevich covered him with a towel, and in a twinkling, with the help of his shaving brush, had transformed his whole beard and part of his cheeks into the kind of cream served up at merchants' birthday parties. "Well, I'll be damned," Ivan Yakovlevich muttered to himself, staring at the nose. He bent Kovalyov's head to one side and looked at him from a different angle. "That's it, all right. You'd never credit it." He continued and contemplated the nose for a long time. Finally, ever so gently, with a delicacy that the reader can best imagine, he lifted 2 fingers to hold the nose by its tip. This was how Ivan Yakovlevich normally shaved his customers. "Come on now, and mind what you're doing," shouted Kovalyov. Ivan Yakovlevich let his arms fall to his side and stood there more frightened and embarrassed than he had ever been in his life. At last he started tickling Kovalyov carefully under the chin with his razor, and, although without the olfactory organ to hold on to, made shaving very awkward, By planting his rough, wrinkled thumb on the cheek and lower gum, in this way gaining some sort of leverage, he finally succeeded in overcoming all obstacles. When everything was ready, Kovalyov rushed to get dressed and took a cab straight to the cafe. He had hardly got inside before he shouted, "Waiter, a cup of chocolate," and went straight up to the mirror. Yes, his nose was there. Gaily he turned around, screwed up his eyes, and looked superciliously at two soldiers, one of whom had a nose no bigger than a waistcoat button. Then he went off to the ministerial department, where he was petitioning for a vice-governorship. Failing this, he was going to try for an administrative post. As he crossed the entrance hall, he had another look in the mirror. His nose was still there. Then he went to see another collegiate assessor, or major, a great wag whose sly digs Kovalyov used to counter by saying, "I'm used to your quips by now, you old joker." On the way he thought, "If the major doesn't split his sides when he sees me, that's a sure sign everything's in its proper place." But the collegiate assessor did not pass any remarks. "That's all right then, damn it," thought Kovalyov. In the street he met Mrs. Podtochin, the staff officer's wife, who was with her daughter, and they replied to his bow with delighted exclamations. Clearly he had suffered no lasting injury. He had a long chat with them, made a point of taking out his snuff box, then stood there for ages, ostentatiously stuffing both nostrils as he murmured to himself, "That'll teach you, you old hens, and I'm not going to marry your daughter simply par amour, as they say, if you don't mind." And from that time onwards, Major Kovalyov was able to stroll along Nevsky Prospect, visit the theater, in fact go everywhere as though absolutely nothing had happened. And, as though absolutely nothing had happened, his nose stayed in the middle of his face and showed no signs of absenting itself. After that he was in perpetual high spirits, always smiling, chasing all the pretty girls, and on one occasion even stopping at a small shop in the Gostiny Dvor to buy ribbon for some medal. No one knows why, as he did not belong to any order of knighthood. And all this took place in the northern capital of our vast empire. Only now, after much reflection, can we see that there is a great deal that is very far-fetched in this story. Apart from the fact that it's highly unlikely for a nose to disappear in such a fantastic way and then reappear in various parts of town dressed as a state councillor, it's hard to believe that Kovalyov was so ignorant as to think newspapers would accept advertisements about noses. I'm not saying I consider such an advertisement too expensive and a waste of money. That's nonsense. And what's more, I don't think I'm a mercenary person. But it's all very nasty, not quite the thing at all, and it makes me feel very awkward. And come to think of it, how did the nose manage to turn up in a loaf of bread? And how did Ivan Yakovlevich... No, I don't understand it, not one bit. But the strangest, most incredible thing of all is that authors should write about such things. That, I confess, is beyond my comprehension. It's just, no, I don't understand it at all. Firstly, it's no use to the country whatsoever. Secondly, but even then, it's no use either. I simply don't know what one can make of it. However, when all is said and done, one can concede this point or the other, and perhaps you can even find, well then, you won't find much that isn't on the absurd side somewhere, will you? And yet, if you stop to think for a moment, there's a grain of truth in it. Whatever you may say, these things do happen in the world. Rarely, I admit, but they do happen. The next story we're going to read is V, which is a very different feel and atmosphere and kind of story. In a sense, a ghost story about reading out loud, but you can still very much hear the Gogol in it. You'll see what I mean. V. Author's note. V is a monstrous creation of popular fancy. It is the name given to the king of the gnomes, whose eyelashes reach to the ground. The following story is a specimen of such folklore. I have made no alterations, but reproduce it in the same simple form in which I heard it. 1. As soon as the clear seminary bell began sounding in Kiev in the morning, the pupils would come flocking from all parts of the town. The students of grammar, rhetoric, philosophy, and theology hastened with their books under their arms over the streets. The grammarians were still mere boys. On the way, they pushed against each other and quarreled with shrill voices. Nearly all of them wore torn or dirty clothes, and their pockets were always crammed with all kinds of things: push bones, pipes made out of pens, remains of confectionery, and sometimes even young sparrows. The latter would sometimes begin to chirp in the midst of deep silence in school and bring down on their possessors severe canings and thrashings. The rhetoricians walked in a more orderly way. Their clothes were generally untorn, but on the other hand, their faces were often strangely decorated. One had a black eye, and the lips of another resembled a single blister, etc. These spoke to each other in tenor voices. The philosophers talked in a tone an octave lower. In their pockets, they only had fragments of tobacco, never whole cakes of it. For what they could get hold of, they used at once. They smelled so strongly of tobacco and brandy that a workman passing them by would often remain standing and sniffing with his nose in the air like a hound. About this time of day, the marketplace was generally full of bustle, and the market women, selling rolls, cakes, and honey tarts, plucked the sleeves of those who wore coats of fine cloth or cotton. Young sir, here, here, they cried from all sides. Rolls and cakes and tasty tarts, very delicious. I have baked them all myself. Another drew something long and crooked out of her basket and said, Here is a sausage, young sir, buy a sausage. Don't buy anything from her, cried a rival. See how greasy she is and what a dirty nose and hands she has. But the market women carefully avoided appealing to the philosophers and theologians, for these only took handfuls of eatables merely to taste them. Arrived at the seminary, the whole crowd of students dispersed into the low, large classrooms with small windows, broad doors, and blackened benches. Suddenly they were filled with a many-toned murmur. The teachers heard the pupils' lessons repeated, some in shrill and others in deep voices, which sounded like a distant booming. While the lessons were being said, the teachers kept a sharp eye open to see whether pieces of cake or other dainties were protruding from their pupils' pockets. If so, they were promptly confiscated. When this learned crowd arrived somewhat earlier than usual, or when it was known that the teachers would come somewhat late, a battle would ensue, as though planned by general agreement. In this battle, all had to take part, even the monitors who were appointed to look after the order and morality of the whole school. Two theologians generally arranged the conditions of the battle, whether each class should split into two sides or whether all the pupils should divide themselves into two halves. In each case, the grammarians began the battle, and after the rhetoricians had joined in, the former retired and stood on the benches in order to watch the fortunes of the fray. Then came the philosophers with long black mustaches, and finally the thick-necked theologians. The battle generally ended in a victory for the latter, and the philosophers retired to the different classrooms, rubbing their aching limbs and throwing themselves on the benches to take breath. When the teacher, who in his own time had taken part in such contests, entered the classroom, he saw by the heated faces of his pupils that the battle had been very severe, and while he caned the hands of the rhetoricians, in another room another teacher did the same for the philosophers. On Sundays and festival days, the seminarists took puppet theaters to the citizens' houses. Sometimes they acted a comedy, and in that case it was always a theologian who took the part of the hero or heroine, Potiphar or Herodias, etc. As a reward for their exertions, they received a piece of linen, a sack of maize, half a roast goose, or something similar. All the students, lay and clerical, were very poorly provided with means for procuring themselves necessary subsistence, but at the same time very fond of eating, so that, however much food was given to them, they were never satisfied, and the gifts bestowed by rich landowners were never adequate for their needs. Therefore, the commissariat committee, consisting of philosophers and theologians, sometimes dispatched the grammarians and rhetoricians under the leadership of a philosopher, themselves sometimes joining in the expedition, with sacks on their shoulders into the town, in order to levy a contribution on the flesh-pots of the citizens, and then there was a feast in the seminary. The most important event in the seminary year was the arrival of the holidays. These began in July, and then generally all the students went home. At that time, all the roads were thronged with grammarians, rhetoricians, philosophers, and theologians. He who had no home of his own would take up his quarters with some fellow student's family. The philosophers and theologians looked out for tutors' posts, taught the children of rich farmers, and received for doing so a pair of new boots and sometimes also a new coat. A whole troop of them would go off in close rank like a regiment. They cooked their porridge in common and encamped under the open sky. Each had a bag with him containing a shirt and a pair of socks. The theologians were especially economical. In order not to wear out their boots too quickly, they took them off and carried them on a stick over their shoulders, especially when the road was very muddy. Then they tucked up their breeches over their knees and waded bravely through the pools and puddles. Whenever they spied a village near the highway, they at once left it, approached the house, which seemed the most considerable, and began with loud noises to sing a psalm. The master of the house, an old Cossack engaged in agriculture, would listen for a long time with his head propped in his hands, then with tears on his cheeks say to his wife, "What the students are singing sounds very devout. Bring out some lard and anything else of the kind we have in the house." After thus replenishing their stores, the students would continue their way. The farther they went, the smaller grew their numbers as they dispersed to the various houses and left those whose homes were still farther on. On one occasion, during such a march, 3 students left the main road in order to get provision in some village, since their stock had long been exhausted. This party consisted of the theologian Chalava, the philosopher Thomas Brutus, and the rhetorician Tiberius Gorobetz. The first was a tall youth with broad shoulders and of a peculiar character. Everything which came within reach of his fingers he felt obliged to appropriate. Moreover, he was of a very melancholy disposition, and when he got himself intoxicated, he would hide himself in the most tangled thickets, so that seminary officials had the greatest trouble in finding him. The philosopher Thomas Brutus was a more cheerful character. He liked to lie for a long time on the same spot and smoke his pipe, and when he was merry with wine, he hired a fiddler and danced the tropak. Often he got a whole quantity of beans, i.e. thrashings, but these he endured with complete philosophic calm, saying that a man cannot escape his destiny. The rhetorician Tiberius Gorobetz had not yet the right to wear a mustache, to drink brandy, or to smoke tobacco. He wore only a small crop of hair, as though his character was at present too little developed. To judge by the great bumps on his forehead, with which he often appeared in the classroom, it might be expected that someday he would be a valiant fighter. Chalava and Thomas often pulled his hair as a mark of their special favor and sent him on their errands. Evening had already come when they left the high road. The sun had just gone down, and the air was still heavy with the heat of the day. The theologian and the philosopher strolled along, smoking in silence, while the rhetorician struck off the heads of the thistles by the wayside with his stick. The way wound on through thick woods of oak and walnut. Green hills alternated here and there with meadows. Twice already they had seen cornfields, from which they concluded that they were near some village, but an hour had already passed, and no human habitation appeared. The sky was already quite dark, and only a red gleam lingered on the western horizon. "The deuce," said the philosopher Thomas Brutus. "I was almost certain we would soon reach a village." The theologian still remained silent, looked round him, then put his pipe again between his teeth, and all 3 continued on their way. "Good heavens!" exclaimed the philosopher, and stood still. "Now the road itself is disappearing." "Perhaps we shall find a farm farther on," answered the theologian, without taking his pipe out of his mouth. Meanwhile the night had descended. Clouds increased the darkness, and according to all appearance there was no chance of moon or stars appearing. The seminarists found that they had lost the way altogether. After the philosopher had vainly sought for a footpath, he exclaimed, "Where have we got to?" The theologian thought for a while and said, "Yes, it is really dark." The rhetorician went on one side, lay on the ground and groped for a path, but his hands encountered only foxholes. All around lay a huge step over which no one seemed to have passed. The wanderers made several efforts to get forward, but the landscape grew wilder and more inhospitable. The philosopher tried to shout, but his voice was lost in vacancy. No one answered. Only some moments later they heard a faint groaning sound like the whimpering of a wolf. "Curse it all! What shall we do?" said the philosopher. "Why, just stop here and spend the night in the open air," answered the theologian. So saying, he felt in his pocket, brought out his timber and steel, and lit his pipe. But the philosopher could not agree with this proposal. He was not accustomed to sleep till he had first eaten 5 pounds of bread and 5 of dripping, and so now he felt an intolerable emptiness in his stomach. Besides, in spite of his cheerful temperament, he was a little afraid of the wolves. "No, Chalava," he said, "that won't do. To lie down like a dog and without any supper? Let us try once more. Perhaps we shall find a house, and the consolation of having a glass of brandy to drink before going to sleep." At the word brandy, the theologian spat on one side and said, "Yes, of course, we cannot remain all night in the open air." The students went on, and to their great joy they heard the barking of dogs in the distance. After listening a while to see from which direction the barking came, they went on their way with new courage and soon espied a light. "A village, by heavens, a village!" exclaimed the philosopher. His supposition proved correct. They soon saw 2 or 3 houses built round a courtyard. Lights glimmered in the windows, and before the fence stood a number of trees. The students looked through the crevices of the gates and saw a courtyard in which stood a large number of roving tradesmen's carts. In the sky there were now fewer clouds, and here and there a star was visible. "See, brother," one of them said, "we must now cry halt. Cost what it may, we must find entrance and a night's lodging." The three students knocked together at the gate and cried, "Open!" The door of one of the houses creaked on its hinges, and an old woman wrapped in a sheepskin appeared. "Who is there?" she exclaimed, coughing loudly. "Let us spend the night here, mother. We have lost our way, our stomachs are empty, and we do not want to spend the night out of doors." "But what sort of people are you?" "Quite harmless people. The theologian Chalava, the philosopher Brutus, and the rhetorician Gorobets." "It is quite impossible," answered the old woman. "The whole house is full of people, and every corner occupied. Where could I put you up? You are big and heavy enough to break the house down. I know these philosophers and theologians. When once one takes them in, they eat one out of house and home. Go farther on. There is no room here for you." "Have a pity on us, mother. How can you be so heartless? Don't let Christians perish. Put us up where you like, and if we eat up your provisions or do any other damage, may our hands wither up and all the punishment of heaven light on us." The old woman seemed a little touched. "Well," she said after a few moments' consideration, "I will let you in, but I must put you in different rooms, for I shall have no quiet if you are all together at night." "Do just as you like. We won't say any more about it," answered the students. The gates moved heavily on their hinges, and they entered the courtyard. "Well now, mother," said the philosopher, following the old woman, "if you had a little scrap of something— By heavens, my stomach is as empty as a drum. I've not had a bit of bread in my mouth since early this morning." "Didn't I say so?" replied the old woman. "There you go, begging all at once. But I have no food in the house, nor any fire." "But we will pay for everything," continued the philosopher. "We will pay early tomorrow in cash." "Go on, and be content with what you get. You are fine fellows whom the devil has brought here." Her reply greatly depressed the philosopher Thomas, but suddenly his nose caught the odor of dried fish. He looked at the breeches of the theologian who walked by his side and saw a huge fish's tail sticking out of his pocket. The latter had already seized the opportunity to steal a whole fish from one of the carts standing in the courtyard. He had not done this from hunger so much as from the force of habit. He had quite forgotten the fish and was looking about to see whether he could not find something else to appropriate. Then the philosopher put his hand in the theologian's pocket as though it were his own and laid hold of his prize. The old woman found a special resting place for each student. The rhetorician she put in a shed, the theologian in an empty storeroom, and the philosopher in the sheep's stall. As soon as the philosopher was alone, he devoured the fish in a twinkling, examined the fence which enclosed the stall, kicked away a pig from a neighboring stall, which had inquiringly inserted its nose through a crevice, and lay down on his right side to sleep like a corpse. Then the low door opened, and the old woman came crouching into the stall. "Well, mother, what do you want here?" asked the philosopher. She made no answer, but came with outstretched arms toward him. The philosopher shrank back, but she still approached as though she wished to lay hold of him. A terrible fright seized him, for he saw the old hag's eyes sparkle in an extraordinary way. "Away with you, old witch! Away with you!" he shouted, but she still stretched her hands after him. He jumped up in order to rush out, but she placed herself before the door, fixed her glowing eyes upon him, and again approached him. The philosopher tried to push her away with his hands, but to his astonishment he found he could neither lift his hands nor move his legs nor utter an audible word. He only heard his heart beating and saw the old woman approach him, place his hands crosswise on his breast, and bend his head down. Then, with the agility of a cat, she sprung on his shoulders, struck him on the side with a broom, and he began to run like a racehorse, carrying her on his shoulders. All this happened with such swiftness that the philosopher could scarcely collect his thoughts. He laid hold of his knees with both hands in order to stop his legs from running, but to his great astonishment they kept moving forward against his will, making rapid springs like a Caucasian horse. Not till the house had been left behind them and a wide plain stretched before them, bordered on one side by a black gloomy wood, did he say to himself, "Ah, it is a witch!" The half-moon shone pale and high in the sky. Its mild light, still more subdued by the intervening clouds, fell like a transparent veil on the earth. Woods, meadows, hills, and valleys all seemed to be sleeping with open eyes. Nowhere was a breath of air stirring. The atmosphere was moist and warm. The shadows of the trees and bushes fell sharply defined on the sloping plain. Such was the night through which the philosopher Thomas Brutus sped with his strange rider. A strange, oppressive and yet sweet sensation took possession of his heart. He looked down and saw how the grass beneath his feet seemed to be quite deep and far away. Over it there flowed a flood of crystal clear water, and the grassy plain looked like the bottom of a transparent sea. He saw his own image and that of the old woman who he carried on his back, clearly reflected in it. Then he beheld how, instead of the moon, a strange sun shone there. He heard the deep tones of bells and saw them swinging. He saw a water nixie rise from a bed of tall reeds. She turned to him, and her face was clearly visible, and she sang a song which penetrated his soul. Then she approached him and nearly reached the surface of the water, on which she burst into laughter and again disappeared. Did he see it or did he not? Was he dreaming or was he awake? But what was that below, wind or music? It sounded and drew nearer and penetrated his soul like a song that rose and fell. What is it, he thought, as he gazed into the depths and still sped rapidly along. The perspiration flowed from him in streams. He experienced simultaneously a strange feeling of oppression and delight in all his being. Often he felt as though he had no longer a heart, and pressed his hand on his breast with alarm. Weary to death, he began to repeat all the prayers which he knew, and all the formulas of exorcism against evil spirits. Suddenly he experienced a certain relief. He felt that his pace was slackening. The witch weighed less heavily on his shoulders, and the thick herbage of the plain was again beneath his feet, with nothing especial to remark about it. Splendid, thought the philosopher Thomas, and began to repeat his exorcisms in a still louder voice. Then suddenly he wrenched himself away from under the witch and sprang on her back in his turn. She began to run, with short, trembling steps indeed, but so rapidly that he could hardly breathe. So swiftly did she run that she hardly seemed to touch the ground. They were still on the plain, but owing to the rapidity of their flight, everything seemed indistinct and confused before his eyes. He seized a stick that was lying on the ground and began to belabor the hag with all his might. She uttered a wild cry, which at first sounded raging and threatening. Then it became gradually weaker and more gentle, till at last it sounded quite low, like the pleasant tones of a silver bell, so that it penetrated his innermost soul. Involuntarily the thought passed through his mind, "Is she really an old woman?" "Ah, I can go no farther," she said in a faint voice, and sank to the earth. He knelt beside her and looked in her eyes. The dawn was red in the sky, and in the distance glimmered the gilt domes of the churches of Kiev. Before him lay a beautiful maiden with thick, disheveled hair and long eyelashes. Unconsciously, she had stretched out her white, bare arms, and her tear-filled eyes gazed at the sky. Thomas trembled like an aspen leaf. Sympathy and a strange feeling of excitement and a hitherto unknown fear overpowered him. He began to run with all his might. His heart beat violently, and he could not explain to himself what a strange new feeling had seized him. He did not wish to return to the village, but hastened toward Kiev, thinking all the way as he went of his weird, unaccountable adventure. There were hardly any students left in the town. They were all scattered about the country and had either taken tutors' posts or lived simply without occupation. For at the farms one could live comfortably and at ease without paying a farthing. The great half-decayed building in which the seminary was established was completely empty, and however much the philosopher searched in all its corners for a piece of lard and bread, he could not find even one of the hard biscuits which the seminarists were in the habit of hiding. But the philosopher found a means of extricating himself from his difficulties by making friends with a certain young widow in the marketplace who sold ribbons, etc. The same evening he found himself being stuffed with cakes and fowl. In fact, it is impossible to say how many things were placed before him on a little table in an arbor shaded by cherry trees. Later on the same evening, the philosopher was to be seen in an alehouse. He lay on a bench, smoked his pipe in his usual way, and threw the publican a gold piece. He had a jug of ale standing before him, looked on all who went in and out in a cold-blooded, self-satisfied way, and thought no more of his strange adventure. About this time, a report spread about that the daughter of a rich colonel, whose estate lay about 50 versts distant from Kiev, had returned home one day from a walk in a quite broken-down condition. She had scarcely enough strength to reach her father's house. Now she lay dying, and had expressed a wish that for 3 days after her death the prayers for the dead should be recited by a Kiev seminarist named Thomas Brutus. This fact was communicated to the philosopher by the rector of the seminary himself, who sent for him to his room and told him that he must start at once, as a rich colonel had sent his servants in a kibitka for him. The philosopher trembled, and was seized by an uncomfortable feeling which he could not define. He had a gloomy foreboding that some evil was about to befall him. Without knowing why, he declared that he did not wish to go. "Listen, Thomas," said the rector, who, under certain circumstances, spoke very politely to his pupils. "I have no idea of asking you whether you wish to go or not. I only tell you that if you think of disobeying, I will have you so soundly flogged on the back with young birch rods that you need not think of having a bath for a long time." The philosopher scratched the back of his head and went out silently, intending to make himself scarce at the first opportunity. Lost in thought, he descended the steep flight of steps which led to the courtyard, thickly planted with poplars. There he remained standing for a moment, and heard quite distinctly the rector giving orders in a loud voice to his steward and to another person, probably one of the messengers sent by the colonel. "Thank your master for the peeled barley and the eggs," said the rector, "and tell him that as soon as the books which he mentions in his note are ready, I will send them. I've already given them to a clerk to be copied. And don't forget to remind your master that he has some excellent fish, especially prime sturgeon, in his ponds. He might send me some when he has the opportunity, as here in the market the fish are bad and expensive. And you, Yantuch, give the colonel's man a glass of brandy, and mind you tie up the philosopher, or he will show you a clean pair of heels." "Listen to the scoundrel," thought the philosopher. "He has smelled a rat, the long-legged stork." He descended into the courtyard and beheld there a kibitka, which at first he took for a barn on wheels. It was, in fact, as roomy as a kiln, so that bricks might have been made inside it. It was one of those remarkable Krakow vehicles that travel from town to town in scores, wherever they think they'll find a market. 6 stout, strong, though somewhat elderly Cossacks were standing by it. Their gold-braided coats of fine cloth showed that their master was rich and of some importance, and certain little scars testified to their valor on the battlefield. "What can I do?" thought the philosopher. "There is no escaping one's destiny." So he stepped up to the Cossacks and said, "Good day, comrades." "Welcome, Mr. Philosopher," some of them answered. "Well, I am to travel with you. It is a magnificent vehicle," he continued as he got into it. "If there were only musicians present, one might dance in it." "Yes, it is a roomy carriage," said one of the Cossacks, taking his seat by the coachman. The latter had tied a cloth round his head, as he had already found an opportunity of pawning his cap in the alehouse. The other 5, with the philosopher, got into the capacious kibitka and sat upon sacks which were filled with all sorts of articles purchased in the city. "I should like to know," said the philosopher, "if this equipage were laden with salt or iron, how many horses would be required to draw it?" "Yes," said the Cossack who sat by the coachman, after thinking a short time, "it would require a good many horses." After giving this satisfactory answer, the Cossack considered himself entitled to remain silent for the rest of the whole journey. The philosopher would gladly have found out who the colonel was and what sort of a character he had. He was also curious to know about his daughter, who had returned home in such a strange way and now lay dying, and whose destiny seemed to be mingled with his own, and wanted to know the sort of life that was lived in the colonel's house. But the Cossacks were probably philosophers like himself, for in answer to his inquiries they only blew clouds of tobacco and settled themselves more comfortably onto their sacks. Meanwhile, one of them addressed to the coachman on the box a brief command: "Keep your eyes open, Overko, you old sleepyhead, and when you come to the alehouse on the road to Chukrailov, don't forget to pull up and wake me and the other fellows if we're asleep." Then he began to snore pretty loud. But in any case, the admonition was quite superfluous, for scarcely had the enormous equipage begun to approach the aforesaid alehouse than they all cried with one mouth, "Halt! Halt!" Besides this, Overka's horse was accustomed to stop outside every inn of its own accord. In spite of the intense July heat, they all got out and entered a low, dirty room where an innkeeper received them in a friendly way as old acquaintances. He brought in the skirt of his long coat some sausages and laid them on the table. All sat down, and it was not long before each of the guests had an earthenware jug standing in front of him. The philosopher Thomas had to take part in the feast, and as the Cossacks, when they are intoxicated, always begin to kiss each other or to weep, the whole room soon began to echo with demonstrations of affection. Come here, spirit, let me embrace thee. Come here, Dorosh, let me press you to my heart." One Cossack, with a grey mustache, the eldest of them all, leant his head on his hand and began to weep bitterly because he was an orphan and alone in God's wide world. Another tall, loquacious man did his best to comfort him, saying, "Don't weep, for God's sake, don't weep, for over there God knows best." The Cossack who had been addressed as Dorosh was full of curiosity and addressed many questions to the philosopher Thomas. "I should like to know," he said, "what you learn in your seminary. Do you learn the same things as the deacon reads to us in church, or something else?" "Don't ask," said the consoler. "Let them learn what they like. God knows what is to happen. God knows everything." "No, I will know," answered Dorosh. "I will know what is written in their books. Perhaps it is something quite different from that in the deacon's book." "Oh, good heavens," said the other. "Why all this talk? It is God's will, and one cannot change God's arrangements." "But I will know everything that is written. I will enter the seminary too. By heaven, I will. Do you think perhaps that I could not learn? I will learn everything, everything." "Oh, heavens," exclaimed the consoler, and let his head sink on the table, for he could no longer hold it upright. The other Cossacks talked about the nobility and why there was a moon in the sky. When the philosopher Thomas saw the state they were in, he determined to profit by it and to make his escape. In the first place, he turned to the gray-headed Cossack, who was lamenting the loss of his parents. "But, little uncle," he said to him, "why do you weep so? I too am an orphan. Let me go, children. Why do you want me?" "Let him go," said some of them. "He is an orphan. Let him go where he likes." They were about to take him outside themselves when the one who had displayed a special thirst for knowledge stopped them, saying, "No, I want to talk to him about the seminary. I'm going to the seminary myself." Moreover, it was not yet certain whether the philosopher could have executed his project of flight, for when he tried to rise from his chair, he felt as though his feet were made of wood, and he began to see such a number of doors leading out of the room that it would have been difficult for him to have found the right one. It was not till evening that the company remembered that they must continue their journey. They crowded into the kibitka, whipped up the horses, and struck up a song, the words and sense of which were hard to understand. During a great part of the night they wandered about, having lost the road, which they ought to have been able to find blindfolded. At last they drove down a steep descent into a valley, and the philosopher noticed, by the side of the road, hedges, behind which he caught glimpses of small trees and house roofs. All these belonged to the colonel's estate. It was already long past midnight. The sky was dark, though little stars glimmered here and there. No light was to be seen in any of the houses. They drove into a large courtyard while the dogs barked. On all sides were barns and cottages with thatched roofs. Just opposite the gateway was a house which was larger than the others and seemed to be the colonel's dwelling. The kibitka stopped before a small barn, and the travelers hastened into it and laid themselves down to sleep. The philosopher, however, attempted to look at the exterior of the house, but rub his eyes as he might, he could distinguish nothing. The house seemed to turn into a bear, and the chimney into the rector of the seminary. Then he gave it up and lay down to sleep. When he woke up the next morning, the whole house was in commotion. The young lady had died during the night. The servants ran hither and thither in a distracted state. The old women wept and lamented, and a number of curious people gazed through the enclosure into the courtyard, as though there were something special to be seen. The philosopher began now to inspect the locality and the buildings, which he had not been able to do during the night. The colonel's house was one of those low, small buildings, such as used formerly to be constructed in Russia. It was thatched with straw. A small, high-peaked gable with a window shaped like an eye was painted all over with blue and yellow flowers and red crescent moons. It rested on little oaken pillars, which were round above the middle, hexagonal below, and whose capitals were adorned with quaint carvings. Under this gable was a small staircase with seats at the foot of it on either side. The walls of the house were supported by similar pillars. Before the house stood a large pear tree of pyramidal shape, whose leaves incessantly trembled. A double row of buildings formed a broad street leading up to the colonel's house. Behind the barns, near the entrance gate, stood 2 three-cornered wine houses, also thatched with straw. Each of the stone walls had a door in it and was covered with all kinds of paintings. On one was represented a Cossack sitting on a barrel and swinging a large pitcher over his head. It bore the inscription, "I will drink all that." Elsewhere were painted large and small bottles, a beautiful girl, a running horse, a pipe, and a drum bearing the words, "Wine is the Cossack's joy." In the loft of one of the barns, one saw through a huge round window a drum and some trumpets. At the gate there stood 2 cannons. All this showed that the colonel loved a cheerful life, and the whole place often rang with sound of merriment. Before the gate were 2 windmills, and behind the house gardens sloped away. Through the treetops the dark chimneys of the peasants' houses were visible. The whole village lay on a broad, even plateau in the middle of a mountain slope which culminated in a steep summit on the north side. When seen from below, it looked still steeper. Here and there on the top, the irregular stems of the thick step brooms showed in dark relief against the blue sky. The bare clay soil made a melancholy impression, worn as it was into deep furrows by rainwater. On the same slope there stood 2 cottages, and over one of them a huge apple tree spread its branches. The roots were supported by small props whose interstices were filled with mold. The apples, which were blown off by the wind, rolled down to the courtyard below. A road wound round the mountain to the village. When the philosopher looked at this steep slope and remembered his journey of the night before, he came to the conclusion that either the colonel's horses were very sagacious, or that the Cossacks must have very strong heads, as they ventured, even when the worse for drink, on such a road with a huge kibitka. When the philosopher turned and looked in the opposite direction, he saw quite another picture. The village reached down to the plain. Meadows stretched away to an immense distance, their bright green growing gradually dark. Far away, about 20 versts off, many other villages were visible. To the right of these meadows were chains of hills, and in the remote distance one saw the Dnieper shimmer and sparkle like a mirror of steel. "What a splendid country," said the philosopher to himself. "It must be fine to live here. One could catch fish in the Dnieper and in the ponds, and shoot and snare partridges and bustards. There must be quantities here. Much fruit might be dried and sold in the town, or better still, brandy might be distilled from it, for fruit brandy is the best of all. But what prevents me from thinking of my escape after all?" Behind the hedge he saw a little path which was almost entirely concealed by the high grass of the steppe. The philosopher approached it mechanically, meaning at first to walk a little along it unobserved, and then quite quietly to gain the open country behind the peasants' houses. Suddenly he felt the pressure of a fairly heavy hand on his shoulder. Behind him stood the same old Cossack who yesterday had so bitterly lamented the death of his father and mother and his own loneliness. "You are giving yourself useless trouble, Mr. Philosopher, if you think you can escape from us," he said. "One cannot run away here, and besides, the roads are too bad for walkers. Come to the colonel. He's been waiting for you for some time in his room." "Yes, of course. What are you talking about? I will come with the greatest pleasure," said the philosopher, and followed the Cossack. The colonel was an elderly man. His mustache was gray, and his face wore the signs of deep sadness. He sat in a room by a table with his head propped on both hands. He seemed about 55, but his attitude was of utter despair, and the pallor on his face showed that his heart had been suddenly broken and that all his former cheerfulness had forever disappeared. When Thomas entered with the Cossack, he answered their deep bows with a slight inclination of the head. "Who are you? Whence do you come? And what is your profession, my good man?" asked the colonel in an even voice, neither friendly nor austere. "I am a student of philosophy. My name is Thomas Brutus." "And who is your father?" "I don't know, sir." "And your mother?" "I don't know either. I know that I must have had a mother, but who she was and where she lived, by heavens, I do not know." The colonel was silent and seemed for a moment lost in thought. "Where did you come to know my daughter?" "I do not know her, gracious sir. I declare that I do not know her." "Why then has she chosen you and no one else to offer up prayers for her?" The philosopher shrugged his shoulders. "God only knows. It is a well-known fact that grand people often demand things which the most learned man cannot comprehend. And does not the proverb say, 'Dance, devil, as the Lord commands'?" "Aren't you talking nonsense, Mr. Philosopher?" "May the lightning strike me on the spot if I lie." "If she had only lived a moment longer," said the colonel sadly, "then I'd certainly found out everything. She said, 'Let no one offer up prayers for me, but send, Father, at once to the seminary in Kiev for the student Thomas Brutus. He shall pray 3 nights running for my sinful soul. He knows.' But what he really knows she never said. The poor dove could speak no more, and died. Good man, you are probably well known for your sanctity and devout life, and she has perhaps heard of you." "What? Of me?" said the philosopher, and took a step backward in amazement. "I and sanctity!" he exclaimed, and stared at the colonel. "God help us, gracious sir, what are you saying? It was only last Holy Thursday that I paid a visit to the tart shop." "Well, she must at any rate have had some reason for making the arrangement, and you must begin your duties today." "I should like to remark to your honor, naturally anyone who knows the Holy Scripture at all can in his measure, but I believe it would be better on this occasion to send for a deacon or subdeacon. They are learned people, and they know exactly what is to be done. I have not got a good voice, nor any official standing." You may say what you like, but I shall carry out all my dove's wishes. If you read the prayers for her 3 nights through in the proper way, I will reward you. And if not, I advise the devil himself not to oppose me." The colonel spoke these last words in such an emphatic way that the philosopher quite understood them. "Follow me," said the colonel. They went into the hall. The colonel opened a door which was opposite his own. The philosopher remained for a few minutes in the hall in order to look about him. Then he stepped over the threshold with a certain nervousness. The whole floor of the room was covered with red cloth. In a corner, under the icons of the saints, on a table covered with a gold-bordered velvet cloth, lay the body of the girl. Tall candles, round which were wound branches of the kalina, stood at her head and feet and burned dimly in the broad daylight. The face of the dead was not to be seen, as the inconsolable father sat before his daughter with his back turned to the philosopher. The words which the latter overheard filled him with a certain fear. "I do not mourn, my daughter, that in the flower of your age you have prematurely left the earth to my grief, but I mourn, my dove, that I do not know my deadly enemy who caused your death. Had I only known that anyone could even conceive the idea of insulting you, or of speaking a disrespectful word to you, I swear by heaven he would never have seen his children again if he had been as old as myself, nor his father and mother if he had been young, and I would have thrown his corpse to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the steppe. But woe is me, my flower, my dove, my light! I will spend the remainder of my life without joy and wipe the bitter tears which flow out of my old eyes, while my enemy will rejoice and laugh in secret over the helpless old man." He paused, overpowered by grief, and streams of tears flowed down his cheeks. The philosopher was deeply affected by the sight of such inconsolable sorrow. He coughed gently in order to clear his throat. The colonel turned and signed to him to take his place at the head of the dead girl, before a little prayer desk on which some books lay. "I can manage to hold out for 3 nights," thought the philosopher, "and then the colonel will fill both my pockets with ducats." He approached the dead girl and, after coughing once more, began to read, without paying attention to anything else, and firmly resolved not to look at her face. Soon there was deep silence, and he saw that the colonel had left the room. Slowly he turned his head in order to look at the corpse. A violent shudder thrilled through him. Before him lay a form of such beauty as is seldom seen upon earth. It seemed to him that never in a single face had so much intensity of expression and harmony of feature been united. Her brow, soft as snow and pure as silver, seemed to be thinking. The fine, regular eyebrows shadowed proudly the closed eyes, whose lashes gently rested on her cheeks, which seemed to glow with secret longing. Her lips still appeared to smile, but at the same time he saw something in these features which appalled him. A terrible depression seized his heart, as when in the middle of dance and song someone begins to chant a dirge. He felt as though those ruby lips were colored with his own heart's blood. Moreover, her face seemed dreadfully familiar. "The witch!" he cried out in a voice which sounded strange to himself. Then he turned away and began to read the prayers with white cheeks. It was the witch whom he had killed. 2. When the sun had sunk below the horizon, the corpse was carried into the church. The philosopher supported one corner of the black-draped coffin on his shoulder and felt an ice-cold shiver run through his body. The colonel walked in front of him, with his right hand resting on the edge of the coffin. The wooden church, black with age and overgrown with green lichen, stood quite at the end of the village in gloomy solitude. It was adorned with 3 round cupolas. One saw at the first glance that it had not been used for divine worship for a long time. Lighted candles were standing before almost every icon. The coffin was set down before the altar. The old colonel kissed his dead daughter once more and then left the church, together with the bearers of the bier, after he had ordered his servants to look after the philosopher and to take him back to the church after supper. The coffin bearers, when they returned to the house, all laid their hands on the stove. This custom is always observed by those who have seen a corpse. The hunger which the philosopher now began to feel caused him for a while to forget the dead girl altogether. Gradually all the domestics of the house assembled in the kitchen. It was really a kind of club where they were accustomed to gather. Even the dogs came to the door, wagging their tails in order to have bones and offal thrown to them. If a servant was on an errand, he always found his way into the kitchen to rest there for a while and to smoke a pipe. All the Cossacks of the establishment lay here during the whole day, on or under the benches, in fact, wherever a place could be found to lie down in. Moreover, everyone was always leaving something behind in the kitchen, his cap or his whip or something of the sort. But the numbers of the club were not complete till the evening, when the groom came in after tying up his horses in the stable, the cowherd had shut up his cows in their stalls, and the others collected there who were not usually seen in the daytime. During supper time, even the tongues of the laziest were set in motion. They talked of all and everything, of the new pair of breeches which someone had ordered for himself, of what might be in the center of the earth, and of the wolf which somebody had seen. There were also a number of wits in the company. The philosopher took his place with the rest in the great circle which sat round the kitchen door in the open air. Soon an old woman with a red cap issued from it, bearing with both hands a large vessel full of hot galutskis, which she distributed among them. Each drew out of his pocket a wooden spoon or a one-pronged wooden fork. As soon as their jaws began to move a little more slowly and their wolfish hunger was somewhat appeased, they began to talk. The conversation, as might be expected, turned on the dead girl. "Is it true," said a young shepherd, "is it true, though I cannot understand it, that our young mistress had traffic with evil spirits?" "Who, the young lady?" answered Dorosh, whose acquaintance the philosopher had already made in the kibitka. "Yes, she was a regular witch. I can swear that she was a witch." "Hold your tongue, Dorosh," exclaimed another, the one who during the journey had played the part of a consoler. "We have nothing to do with that. May God be merciful to her. One ought not to talk of such things." But Dorosh was not at all inclined to be silent. He had just visited the wine cellar with the steward on important business, and, having stooped 2 or 3 times over 1 or 2 casks, he had returned in a very cheerful and loquacious mood. "Why do you ask me to be silent?" he answered. "She has ridden on my own shoulders. I swear she has." "Say, uncle," said the young shepherd, "are there any signs by which to recognize a sorceress?" "No, there are not," answered Dorosh. "Even if you knew the Psalter by heart, you could not recognize one." "Yes, Dorosh, it is possible. Don't talk such nonsense," retorted the former consoler. "It is not for nothing that God has given each some special peculiarity. The learned maintain that every witch has a little tail." "Every old woman is a witch," said a gray-headed Cossack quite seriously. "Yes, you are a fine lot," retorted the old woman, who entered at that moment with a vessel full of fresh galutskis. "You are great fat pigs." A self-satisfied smile played round the lips of the old Cossack, whose name was Yavtuch, when he found that his remark had touched the old woman on a tender point. The shepherd burst into such a deep and loud explosion of laughter as if 2 oxen were lowing together. This conversation excited in the philosopher a great curiosity and a wish to obtain more exact information regarding the colonel's daughter. In order to lead the talk back to the subject, he turned to his next neighbor and said, "I should like to know why all the people here think that the young lady was a witch. Has she done harm to anyone or killed them by witchcraft?" "Yes, there are reports of that kind," answered a man whose face was as flat as a shovel. "Who does not remember the huntsman Mikita or the—" "What has the huntsman Mikita got to do with it?" asked the philosopher. "Stop, I will tell you the story of Mikita," interrupted Dorosh. "No, I will tell it," said the groom, "for he was my godfather." "I will tell the story of Mikita," said Spirid. "Yes, yes, Spirid shall tell it," exclaimed the whole company, and Spirid began. "You, Mr. Philosopher Thomas, did not know Mikita? Ah, he was an extraordinary man. He knew every dog as though he were his own father. The present huntsman, Nikolai, who sits 3 places away from me, is not fit to hold a candle to him, though good enough in his way, but compared to Mikita, he's a mere milksop." "You tell the tale splendidly," exclaimed Dorosh, and nodded as a sign of approval. Spirid continued. "He saw a hare in the field, quicker than you can take a pinch of snuff. He only needed to whistle, 'Come here, Razboy, come here, Bozdraya,' and flew away on his horse like the wind, so that you could not say whether he went quicker than the dog or the dog than he. He could empty a quart pot of brandy in the twinkling of an eye. Ah, he was a splendid huntsman, only for some time he always had his eye fixed on the young lady. Either he had fallen in love with her, or she had bewitched him. In short, he went to the dogs. He became a regular old woman. Yes, he became the devil knows what. It is not fitting to relate it." "Very good," remarked Dorosh. "If the young lady only looked at him, he let the reins slip out of his hands, called Bravko instead of Rasboy, stumbled, and made all kinds of mistakes. One day, when he was grooming a horse, the young lady came to him in the stable. 'Listen, Mikita,' she said, 'I should like for once to set my foot on you.' And he, the booby, was quite delighted and answered, "Don't only set your foot there, but sit on me altogether." The young lady lifted her white little foot, and as soon as he saw it, his delight robbed him of his senses. He bowed his neck, the idiot, took her feet in both hands, and began to trot about like a horse all over the place. Whither they went he could not say. He returned more dead than alive, and from that time he wasted away and became as dry as a chip of wood. At last someone coming into the stable one day found instead of him only a handful of ashes and an empty jug. He had burned completely out. But it must be said that he was a huntsman such as the world cannot match. When Spirit had ended his tale, they all began to vie with one another in praising the deceased huntsman. "And have you heard the story of Chepchichka?" asked Dorosh, turning to Thomas. "No." "Ha! Ha! One sees they don't teach you much in your seminary. Well, listen, we have here in our village a Cossack called Chepton, a fine fellow. Sometimes, indeed, he amuses himself by stealing and lying without any reason, but he's a fine fellow for all that. His house is not far away from here. One evening, just about this time, Chepton and his wife went to bed after they had finished their day's work. Since it was fine weather, Cheptichka went to sleep in the courtyard and Cheptun in the house. No, I mean Cheptichka went to sleep in the house on a bench and Cheptun outside. No, Cheptichka didn't go to sleep on the bench, but on the ground, interrupted the old woman who stood at the door. Dorosh looked at her, and then at the ground, and then again at her. The rebuke was effectual. The old woman was silent and did not interrupt again. Dorosh continued, "In the cradle which hung in the middle of the room lay a 1-year-old child. I do not know whether it was a boy or a girl. Cheptichka had lain down and heard on the other side of the door a dog scratching and howling loud enough to frighten anyone. She was afraid, for women are such simple folk that if one puts out one's tongue at them behind the door in the dark, their hearts sink into their boots. But, she thought to herself, I must give this cursed dog one on the snout to stop his howling. So she seized the poker and opened the door. But hardly had she done so than the dog rushed between her legs straight to the cradle. Then Chepchichka saw that it was not a dog, but the young lady. And if it had only been the young lady as she knew her, it wouldn't have mattered. But she looked quite blue, and her eyes sparkled like fiery coals. She seized the child, bit its throat, and began to suck its blood. Chepchichka shrieked, "Ah, my darling child!" and rushed out of the room. Then she saw that the house door was shut and rushed up to the attic and sat there, the stupid woman, trembling all over. Then the young lady came after her and bit her too, poor fool. The next morning, Chepton carried his wife, all bitten and wounded, down from the attic, and the next day she died. Such strange things happen in the world. One may wear fine clothes, but that does not matter. A witch is and remains a witch. After telling his story, Dorosh looked around him with a complacent air and cleaned out his pipe with his little finger in order to fill it again. The story of the witch had made a deep impression on all, and each of them had something to say about her. One had seen her come to the door of his house in the form of a hayrick. From others, she had stolen their caps or their pipes. She had cut off the hair plates of many girls in the village and drunk whole pints of the blood of others. At last the whole company observed that they had gossiped over their time, for it was already night. All looked for a sleeping place, some in the kitchen and others in the barn or the courtyard. "Now, Mr. Thomas, it is time that we go to the dead," said the gray-haired Cossack, turning to the philosopher. All four, Spirid, Dorosh, the old Cossack, and the philosopher, betook themselves to the church, keeping off with their whips the wild dogs who roamed about the roads in great numbers and bit the sticks of passer-by in sheer malice. Although the philosopher had seized the opportunity of fortifying himself beforehand with a stiff glass of brandy, yet he felt a certain secret fear which increased as he approached the church, which was lit up within. The strange tales he had heard made a deep impression on his imagination. They had passed the thick hedges and trees, and the country became more open. At last they reached the small enclosure round the church. Behind it were no more trees, but a huge empty plain dimly visible in the darkness. The three Cossacks ascended the steep steps with Thomas and entered the church. Here they left the philosopher, expressing their hope that he would successfully accomplish his duties, and locked him in as their master had ordered. He was left alone. At first he yawned, then he stretched himself, blew on both hands, and finally looked round him. In the middle of the church stood the black bier. Before the dark pictures of saints burned the candles, whose light only illuminated the icons and cast a faint glimmer into the body of the church. All the corners were in complete darkness. The lofty icons seemed to be of considerable age. Only a little of the original gilt remained on their broken traceries. The faces of the saints had become quite black and looked uncanny. Once more the philosopher cast a glance around him. "Bother it," said he to himself. "What is there to be afraid about? No living creature can get in, and as for the dead and those who come from the other side, I can protect myself with such effectual prayers that they cannot touch me with the tips of their fingers. There's nothing to fear," he repeated, swinging his arms. "Let us begin the prayers." As he approached one of the side aisles, he noticed 2 packets of candles which had been placed there. "That is fine," he thought. "I must illuminate the whole church till it is bright as day. What a pity that one cannot smoke in it." He began to light the candles on all the wall brackets and all the candelabra, as well as those already burning before the holy pictures. Soon the whole church was brilliantly lit up. Only the darkness in the roof above seemed still denser by contrast, and the faces of the saints peering out of the frames looked as unearthly as before. He approached the bier, looked nervously at the face of the dead girl, could not help shuddering slightly and involuntarily closing his eyes. What terrible and extraordinary beauty! He turned away and tried to go to one side, but the strange curiosity and peculiar fascination which men feel in moments of fear compelled him to look again and again, though with a similar shudder. And in truth, there was something terrible about the beauty of the dead girl. Perhaps she would not have inspired so much fear had she been less beautiful, but there was nothing ghastly or death-like in the face, which wore rather an expression of life, and it seemed to the philosopher as though she were watching him from under her closed eyelids. He even thought he saw a tear roll from under the eyelash of her right eye, but when it was halfway down her cheek, he saw that it was a drop of blood. He quickly went into one of the stalls, opened his book, and began to read the prayers in a very loud voice in order to keep up his courage. His deep voice sounded strange to himself in the grave-like silence. It aroused no echo in the silent and desolate wooden walls of the church. "What is there to be afraid of?" he thought to himself. "She will not rise from her bier, since she fears God's word. She will remain quietly resting. Yes, and what sort of Cossack should I be if I were afraid? The fact is, I've drunk a little too much. That's why I feel so queer. Let me take a pinch of snuff. It really is excellent, first rate." At the same time, he cast a furtive glance over the pages of the prayer book toward the bier, and involuntarily he said to himself, "There, see? She's getting up. Her head is already above the edge of the coffin." But a death-like silence prevailed. The coffin was motionless, and all the candles shone steadily. It was an awe-inspiring sight, this church lit up at midnight, with the corpse in the midst and no living soul near but one. The philosopher began to sing in various keys in order to stifle his fears, but every moment he glanced across at the coffin, and involuntarily the question came to his lips, "Suppose she rose up after all?" But the coffin did not move. Nowhere was there the slightest sound nor stir. Not even did a cricket chirp in any corner. There was nothing audible but the slight sputtering of some distant candle or the faint fall of a drop of wax. Suppose she rose up after all? He raised his head. Then he looked round him wildly and rubbed his eyes. Yes, she was no longer lying in the coffin, but sitting upright. He turned away his eyes, but at once looked again, terrified at the coffin. She stood up, and then she walked with closed eyes through the church, stretching out her arms as if she wanted to seize someone. She now came straight towards him. Full of alarm, he traced with his finger a circle round himself. Then in a loud voice he began to recite the prayers and formulas of exorcism, which he had learned from a monk who had often seen witches and evil spirits. She had almost reached the edge of the circle which he had traced, but it was evident that she had not the power to enter it. Her face wore a bluish tint like that of one who has been several days dead. Thomas had not the courage to look at her. So terrible was her appearance. Her teeth chattered, and she opened her dead eyes. But as in her rage she saw nothing, she turned in another direction and felt with outstretched arms among the pillars and corners of the church in hopes of seizing him. At last she stood still, made a threatening gesture, and then lay down again in the coffin. The philosopher could not recover his self-possession and kept on gazing anxiously at it. Suddenly it rose from its place and began hurtling about the church with a whizzing sound. At one time it was almost directly over his head, but the philosopher observed that it could not pass the area of his charmed circle, so he kept on repeating his formulas of exorcism. The coffin now fell with a crash in the middle of the church and remained lying there motionless. The corpse rose again. It now had a greenish-blue color, but at the same moment the distant crowing of a cock was audible, and it lay down again. The The philosopher's heart beat violently, and the perspiration poured in streams from his face. But heartened by the crowing of the cock, he rapidly repeated the prayers. As the first light of dawn looked through the windows, there came a deacon and the gray-haired Yavtuk, who acted as sacristan in order to release him. When he had reached the house, he could not sleep for a long time, but at last weariness overpowered him, and he slept till noon. When he awoke, his experiences of the night appeared to him like a dream. He was given a quart of brandy to strengthen him. At table, he was again talkative, and ate a fairly large sucking pig, almost without assistance. But nonetheless, he resolved to say nothing of what he had seen, and all curious questions only returned the answer, "Yes, some wonderful things happened." The philosopher was one of those men who, when they have had a good meal, are uncommonly amiable. He lay down on a bench with his pipe in his mouth, looked blandly at all, and expectorated every minute. But as the evening approached, he became more and more pensive. About supper time, nearly the whole company had assembled in order to play kraple. This is a kind of game of skittles in which, instead of bowls, long staves are used, and the winner has the right to ride on the back of his opponent. It provided the spectators with much amusement. Sometimes the groom, a huge man, would clamber on the back of the swineherd, who was slim and short and shrunken. Another time the groom would present his own back, while Doros sprang on it, shouting, "What a regular ox!" Those of the company who were more staid sat by the threshold of the kitchen. They looked uncommonly serious, smoked their pipes, and did not even smile when the younger ones went into fits of laughter over some joke of the groom or spirit. Thomas vainly attempted to take part in the game. A gloomy thought was firmly fixed like a nail in his head. In spite of his desperate efforts to appear cheerful after supper, fear had overmastered his whole being, and it increased with the growing darkness. "Now it is time for us to go, Mr. Student," said the gray-haired Cossack, and stood up with Doros. "Let us betake ourselves to our work." Thomas was conducted to the church in the same way as on the previous evening. Again he was left alone, and the door was bolted behind him. As soon as he found himself alone, he began to feel in the grip of his fears. He again saw the dark pictures of the saints in their gilt frames, and the black coffin which stood menacing and silent in the middle of the church. "Never mind," he said to himself. "I'm over the first shock. The first time I was frightened, but I am not so at all now. No, not at all." He quickly went into a stall, drew a circle around him with a finger, uttered some prayers and formulas for exorcism, and then began to read the prayers for the dead in a loud voice and with a fixed resolution not to look up from the book nor take notice of anything. He did so for an hour, and began to grow a little tired. He cleared his throat and drew his snuff-box out of his pocket, but before he had taken a pinch, he looked nervously toward the coffin. A sudden chill shot through him. The witch was already standing before him on the edge of the circle and had fastened her green eyes upon him. He shuddered, looked down at the book, and began to read his prayers and exorcisms aloud. Yet all the while he was aware of how her teeth chattered and how she stretched out her arms to seize him. But when he cast a hasty glance towards her, he saw that she was not looking in his direction, and it was clear that she could not see him. Then she began to murmur in an undertone, and terrible words escaped her lips, words that sounded like the bubbling of boiling pitch. The philosopher did not know their meaning, but he knew at once that they signified something terrible, that they were intended to counteract his exorcisms. After she had spoken, a stormy wind arose in the church, and there was a noise like the rushing of many birds. He heard the noise of their wings and claws as they flapped about and scratched at the iron bars of the church windows. There were also violent blows on the church door, as if someone were trying to break it in pieces. The philosopher's heart beat violently. He did not dare to look up, and continued to read the prayers without a pause. At last there were heard in the distance the shrill sound of a cock's crow. The exhausted philosopher stopped and gave a great sigh of relief. Those who came to release him found him more dead than alive. He had leant his back against the wall and stood motionless, regarding them without any expression in his eyes. They were obliged almost to carry him to the house. He then shook himself, asked for and drank a quart of brandy. He passed his hands through his hair and said, "There are all sorts of horrors in the world, and such dreadful things happen that—" Here he made a gesture as though to ward off something. All who heard him bent their heads forward in curiosity. Even a small boy who ran on everyone's errands stood by with his mouth wide open. Just then a young woman in a close-fitting dress passed by. She was the old cook's assistant, and very coquettish. She always stuck something in her bodice by way of ornament, a ribbon or a flower, or even a piece of paper if she could find nothing else. "Good day, Thomas," she said as she saw the philosopher. "Dear me, what has happened to you?" she exclaimed, striking her hands together. "Well, what is it, you silly creature?" "Good heavens, you've grown quite grey." "Yes, so he has," said Spirid, regarding him more closely. "You have grown as grey as our old Yavtuk." When the philosopher heard that, he hastened into the kitchen, where he noticed on the wall a dirty, three-cornered piece of looking-glass. In front of it hung some forget-me-nots, evergreens, and a small garland, proof that it was the toilette glass of the young coquette. With alarm, he saw that it actually was as they had said. His hair was quite grizzled. He sank into a reverie. At last he said to himself, "I will go to the colonel. I'll tell him all and declare that I will read no more prayers. He must send me back at once to Kiev." With this intention, he turned toward the doorsteps of the colonel's house. The colonel was sitting motionless in his room. His face displayed the same hopeless grief which Thomas had observed on it at his first arrival, only the hollows in his cheeks had deepened. It was obvious that he took very little or no food. A strange paleness made him look almost as though made of marble. "Good day," he said as he observed Thomas standing cap in hand at the door. "Well, how are you getting on? All right?" "Yes, sir, all right. Such hellish things are going on that one would like to rush away as far as one's feet can carry one." "How so?" "Your daughter, sir. When one considers the matter, she is, of course, of noble descent. No one can dispute that. But don't be angry, and may God grant her eternal rest." "Very well. What about her?" "She is in league with the devil. She inspires one with such dread that all prayers are useless." "Pray, pray. It was not for nothing that she sent for you. My dove was troubled about her salvation and wished to expel all evil influences by means of prayer." "I swear, gracious sir, it is beyond my power." "Pray, pray," continued the colonel in the same persuasive tone. "There is only one night more. You are doing a Christian work, and I will reward you richly." "However great your rewards may be, I will not read the prayers any more, sir," said Thomas in a tone of decision. "Listen, philosopher," said the colonel with a menacing air. "I will not allow any objections. In your seminary you may act as you like, but here it won't do. If I have you knouted, it will be somewhat different to the rector's canings. Do you know what a strong kantchuk is?" "Of course I do," said the philosopher in a low voice. "A number of them together are insupportable." "Yes, I think so too, but you don't know yet how hot my fellows can make it," replied the colonel threateningly. He sprang up, and his face assumed a fierce, despotic expression, betraying the savagery of his nature, which had only been temporarily modified by grief. "After the first flogging, they pour on brandy, and then repeat it. Go away and finish your work. If you don't obey, you won't ever be able to stand again, and if you do, you will get 1,000 ducats." "This is a devil of a fellow," thought the philosopher to himself, and went out. "One can't trifle with him. But wait a little, my friend, I will escape you so cleverly that even your hounds can't find me." He determined under any circumstances to run away, and only waited until the hour after dinner arrived, when all the servants were accustomed to take a nap in the hay on the barn, and to snore and puff so loudly that it sounded as if machinery had been set up there. At last the time came. Even Yavtuk stretched himself out in the sun and closed his eyes. Tremblingly and on tiptoe, the philosopher stole softly into the garden, whence he thought he could escape more easily into the open country. This garden was generally so choked up with weeds that it seemed admirably adapted for such an attempt. With the exception of a single path used by the people of the house, the whole of it was covered with cherry trees, elder bushes, and tall heath thistles with fibrous red buds. All these trees and bushes had been thickly overgrown with ivy, which formed a kind of roof. Its tendrils reached to the hedge and fell down on the other side in snake-like curves among the small wild field flowers. Behind the hedge which bordered the garden was a dense mass of wild heather, in which it did not seem probable that anyone would care to venture himself, and the strong, stubborn stems of which seemed likely to baffle any attempt to cut them. As the philosopher was about to climb over the hedge, his teeth chattered, and his heart beat so violently that he felt frightened at it. The skirts of his long cloak seemed to cling to the ground as though they had been fastened to it by pegs. When he had actually got over the hedge, he seemed to hear a shrill voice crying behind him, "Whither? Whither?" He jumped into the heather and began to run, stumbling over old roots and treading on unfortunate moles. When he had emerged from the heather, he saw that he still had a wide field to cross, behind which was a thick, thorny underwood. This, according to his calculation, must stretch as far as the road leading to Kiev, and if he reached it, he would be safe. Accordingly, he ran over the field and plunged into the thorny copse. Every sharp thorn he encountered tore a fragment from his coat. Then he reached a small open space. In the center of it stood a willow whose branches hung down to the earth, and close by flowed a clear spring, bright as silver. The first thing the philosopher did was to lie down and drink eagerly, for he was intolerably thirsty. "Splendid water," he said, wiping his mouth. "This is a good place to rest in." "No, better run farther. Perhaps we're being followed," said a voice immediately behind him. Thomas started and turned. Before him stood Yavtuk. "This devil of a Yavtuk," he thought. "I should like to seize him by his feet and smash his hangdog face against the trunk of a tree." "Why did you go round such a long way?" continued Yavtuk. "You'd much better have chosen the path by which I came. It leads directly by the stable. Besides, it's a pity about your coat. Such splendid cloth. How much does it cost an ell?" "Well, we've had a long enough walk. It's time to go home." The philosopher followed Yavtuk in a very depressed state. "Now the accursed witch will attack me in earnest," he thought. "But what have I really to fear? Am I not a Cossack? I've read the prayers for 2 nights already. With God's help I will get through the 3rd night also. It is plain that the witch must have a terrible load of guilt upon her, else the evil one would not help her so much." Feeling somewhat encouraged by these reflections, he returned to the courtyard and asked Dorosh, who sometimes, by the steward's permission, had access to the wine cellar, to fetch him a small bottle of brandy. The 2 friends sat down before a barn and drank a pretty large one. Suddenly the philosopher jumped up and said, "I want musicians! Bring some musicians!" Without waiting for them, he began to dance the tropak in the courtyard. He danced till tea time, and the servants, who, as is usual in such cases, had formed a small circle around him, grew at last tired of watching him and went away saying, "By heavens, the man can dance!" Finally, the philosopher lay down in the place where he had been dancing and fell asleep. It was necessary to pour a bucket of cold water on his head to wake him up for supper. At the meal, he enlarged on the topic of what a Cossack ought to be, and how he should not be afraid of anything in the world. "It is time," said Yavtuk. "Let us go." "I wish I could put a lighted match to your tongue," thought the philosopher. Then he stood up and said, "Let us go." On their way to the church, the philosopher kept looking round him on all sides and tried to start a conversation with his companions, but both Yavtuk and Dorosh remained silent. It was a weird night. In the distance, wolves howled continually, and even the barking of the dogs had something unearthly about it. "That doesn't sound like wolves howling, but something else," remarked Dorosh. Yavtuk still kept silence, and the philosopher did not know what answer to make. They reached the church and walked over the old wooden planks, whose rotten condition showed how little the lord of the manor cared about God and his soul. Yavtuk and Dorosh left the philosopher alone, as on the previous evenings. There was still the same atmosphere of menacing silence in the church, in the center of which stood the coffin with the terrible witch inside it. "I am not afraid. By heavens, I am not afraid," he said, and after drawing a circle round himself as before, he began to read the prayers and exorcisms. An oppressive silence prevailed. The flickering candles filled the church with their clear light. The philosopher turned one page after the other and noticed he was not reading what was in the book. Full of alarm, he crossed himself and began to sing a hymn. This calmed him somewhat, and he resumed his reading, turning the pages rapidly as he did so. Suddenly, in the midst of the sepulchral silence, the iron lid of the coffin sprang open with a jarring noise, and the dead witch stood up. She was this time still more terrible in aspect than at first. Her teeth chattered loudly, and her lips, through which poured a stream of dreadful curses, moved convulsively. A whirlwind arose in the church. The icons of the saints fell to the ground, together with the broken window panes. The door was wrenched from its hinges, and a huge mass of monstrous creatures rushed into the church, which became filled with the noise of beating wings and scratching claws. All these creatures flew and crept about, seeking for the philosopher, from whose brain the last fumes of intoxication had vanished. He crossed himself ceaselessly and uttered prayer after prayer, hearing all the time the whole unclean swarm rustling around him and brushing him with the tips of their wings. He had not the courage to look at them. He only saw one uncouth monster standing by the wall with long shaggy hair and 2 flaming eyes. Over him, something hung in the air which looked like a gigantic bladder covered with countless crab's claws and scorpion stings, and with black clods of earth hanging from it. All these monsters stared about seeking him, but they could not find him since he was protected by his sacred circle. "Bring V! Bring V!" cried the witch. A sudden silence followed. The howling of wolves was heard in the distance, and soon heavy footsteps resounded through the church. Thomas looked up furtively and saw that an ungainly human figure with crooked legs was being led into the church. He was quite covered with black soil, and his hands and feet resembled knotted roots. He trod heavily and stumbled at every step. His eyelids were of enormous length. With terror, Thomas saw that his face was of iron. They led him in by the arms and placed him near Thomas's circle. "Raise my eyelids, I can't see anything," said V in a dull, hollow voice, and they all hastened to help in doing so. "Don't look," an inner voice warned the philosopher, but he could not refrain from looking. "There he is!" exclaimed V, pointing an iron finger at him, and all the monsters rushed on him at once. Struck dumb with terror, he sank to the ground and died. At that moment there sounded a cock's crow for the second time. The earth spirits had not heard the first one. In alarm, they hurried to the windows and to the door to get out as quickly as possible. But it was too late. They all remained hanging as though fastened to the door and the windows. When the priest came in, he stood amazed at such a desecration of God's house and did not venture to read prayers there. The church remained standing as it was, with the monsters hanging on the windows and the door. Gradually, it became overgrown with creepers, bushes, and wild heather, and no one can discover it now. When the report of this event had reached Kiev, and the theologian Chalava heard what a fate had overtaken the philosopher Thomas, he sank for a whole hour into deep reflection. He had greatly altered of late. After finishing his studies, he had become bell ringer of one of the chief churches in the city, and he always appeared with a bruised nose because the belfry staircase was in a ruinous condition. "Have you heard what has happened to Thomas?" said Tiberius Gorobetz, who had become a philosopher and now wore a moustache. "Yes, God has appointed it so," answered the bell ringer. "Let us go to the alehouse, and we will drink a glass to his memory." The young philosopher, who, with the enthusiasm of a novice, had made such full use of his privileges as a student that his breeches and coat and even his cap reeked of brandy and tobacco, agreed readily to the proposal. "He was a fine fellow, Thomas," said the bell ringer as the limping innkeeper set the third jug of beer before him. "A splendid fellow, and lost his life for nothing." "I know why he perished," said Gorobetz. "Because he was afraid. If he had not feared her, the witch could have done nothing to him. One ought to cross oneself incessantly and spit exactly on her tail, and then not the least harm can happen. I know all about it, for here in Kiev all the old women in the marketplace are witches." The bell ringer nodded assent, but being aware that he could not say any more, he got up cautiously and went out, swaying to the right and left in order to find a hiding place in the thick steppe grass outside the town. At the same time, in accordance with his old habits, he did not forget to steal an old boot sole which lay on the alehouse bench.